Listen, my children, my grandchildren, and the children of my grandchildren who are not yet born. Come closer to the low fire. Sit on the hard ground the way we used to sit in the quarters. Because tonight, I open this old mouth and let out a memory that still burns in my throat like living coal. This is not a story found in white folks' books. No. This is memory carved into black skin. Memory of blood that dripped onto the auction boards and was licked clean by the dogs. I bring to you the name that the wind still carries through the dead fields of Virginia. Alice the cook. Alice. Say it slowly. Alice. 3 syllables heavier than any iron chain. She was born in 1809 in Southampton County, on a place they called Turner's Place, where the tall grass hid the bones of people who had once tried to run. Daughter of a woman named Eve, who came straight off the slave ship, still carrying the smell of the hold on her skin, and of a man whose name no one knew because the overseer cut out his tongue so he could never again sing the names of his ancestors. But hear me, children, a quiet eye is not a dead eye. The old ones warned us, child. They warned us that some smells don't never leave. Smoke from burning flesh, blood on sun-hot wood, the sweet rotten stink of a man's evil intentions, and boiling collard greens mixed with something darker, something that makes your belly turn even when you're hungry enough to eat tree bark. Alice stood at that big iron pot in the kitchen house behind the big house, stirring slow, stirring steady, her face smooth as river stone. Steam rose up around her dark face like spirits ascending, and her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes were somewhere else entirely. Not in that hot kitchen with the fire roaring. Not in Turner's Place where the red clay of Virginia drank black blood like communion wine. Her eyes were in a tomorrow she was cooking up with her own 2 hands. Behind the door, just past where the cornmeal sacks leaned against the wall, she could hear them. The overseers. 7 of them passed around a jug of corn whiskey even though it weren't even noon yet. Their voices came through the cracks in the wood planks like poison seeping through. "That new gal from the auction block?" one said. It was Willis, the young one with yellow hair and hands that moved too quick. "The one Massa bought last Tuesday. 14, maybe 15 years old." "Pretty little thing," another laughed. It was Cyrus, the driver who carried 2 whips and bragged he ain't never needed but one. "Smooth skin like that gonna scar up nice." "We drawin' straws tonight," Willis said, and Alice heard the scratch of matches, smelled sulfur mixing with the whiskey stink. Winner gets first visit to her cabin after the field hands settle down. Silence of death fell in that kitchen then, except for the bubbling pot and Alice's wooden spoon going round, round, round. Slow, steady, like a conjure woman drawing a circle of protection. Or a curse. From the corner by the flour barrel, Dinah, another cook, just 16 herself, belly already swollen with some white man's unwanted seed, made a small sound. A whimper that died before it could grow into a scream. Her eyes found Alice's face, searching for, what? Comfort? Hope? Alice gave her neither, just kept stirring. But something shifted in the air, heavy as storm clouds gathering. The kind of shift folks talk about in hush harbors when they speak of Judgment Day. "You all right, Dinah?" Alice's voice came out flat, empty as a sharecropper's purse. But beneath it ran something else. Something the girl was too young and too scared to hear. A promise. A reckoning. "Yes'm." Dinah wiped her face with her apron, leaving a streak of ash across her cheek. Just the smoke from the fire. Gets in my eyes something terrible." Lies and truth walking hand in hand, Alice thought. Like they'd been doing since the first ship crossed that cursed water. The men behind the door kept talking, kept laughing, kept deciding the fate of a child who probably still remembered her mama's lullabies. Alice listened to every word, memorized every voice. Her mind was a ledger book, and she was keeping accounts that would come due. "Alice!" The call came sharp from the big house, Mistress Turner's voice high and thin like a mosquito whine. "Where's my tea? Lord of Glory, I've been calling you." "Coming, ma'am," Alice called back, never breaking the rhythm of her stirring. She ladled some of the pot liquor into a tin cup, added a spoonful of honey from the jar, sprinkled something else from the small pouch tied inside her apron. Just a pinch. Not enough to kill, not yet. Just enough to give the mistress a bellyache that would keep her in bed for 2 days, crying for Jesus while her insides twisted. Small mercies, Alice thought. Small revenges for a soul in bondage. She wiped her hands on her apron, same apron that hid 3 small pouches tied with red thread, gopher dust in one, hot foot powder in another, and in the third, wrapped in a scrap of cloth torn from her dead grandmother's dress, seeds of a plant old Eve brought from across the water. Seeds that grew into pretty white flowers that bees loved and white folks admired. Seeds that, when dried and ground fine, could stop a man's heart while he sat at supper, fork halfway to his lying mouth. "Dinah, you watch this pot," Alice said, already moving toward the door. "Don't let it boil over. And don't let none of them overseers come sniffing around for early tastes, you hear?" "Yes'm, Alice, I won't." As Alice carried the tea tray across the yard, 37 steps from kitchen house to big house back door, she'd counted them 1,000 times. She passed the whipping post. Blood stained the pale wood dark, new enough that flies still buzzed around it. Someone had been punished that morning. Probably old Moses, who'd dropped a bucket at the well and got 20 lashes for clumsiness. Or maybe young Sarah, who'd looked the overseer in the eye when he called her a name her mama wouldn't want repeated. The sun beat down skin and heat, cruel as any overseer's whip. Sweat ran down Alice's back beneath her rough cotton dress. Her feet, bare and calloused thick as leather, knew every stone in that yard, every rise and dip in the hard ground. She'd walked this path so many times she could do it blind, could do it dead probably, and her spirit wouldn't know the difference. In the slave quarters, them dark cabins of rough-cut wood with gaps wide enough to let winter winds cut through, folks were stirring after the short midday break. Alice could hear old Aunt Bessie's voice raised in a work song, trying to give strength to the field hands heading back out to that cursed cotton that grew white as shrouds under the ruthless sun. The song was a spiritual, but not the kind white folks like to hear. This one had words in it from the old language, from before the ships, before the chains, before names got stolen and replaced with whatever the massa felt like calling you. Ago, yeah, ago, yeah, ago, The ancient words drifted across the yard like ghost voices, and Alice felt them settle in her chest where rage lived, where pain slept, where something was waking up that had been dormant too long. She climbed the back steps, careful, always careful not to spill the tea, and entered the big house through the kitchen door. The house smelled of beeswax and lemon oil and lies. Everything shined and polished to hide the rot underneath. Just like the mistress herself, sitting in her parlor with her pale face and her silk dress and her Bible open on her lap, pretending she couldn't hear the screams from the whipping post, pretending her husband wasn't the kind of man who sold his own children, the ones he'd forced onto the bodies of enslaved women. "There you are, finally," Mistress Turner said without looking up from her Bible. She was reading Philemon, probably. White folks love that one. "Slaves, obey your masters," as if God himself wrote it just to keep black folks in chains. "Yes, ma'am." Alice set the tea down on the small table beside the velvet chair. "Made it just how you like it. It better be hot." The mistress's fingers, soft as a baby's and just as useless, reached for the cup. Last time it was barely warm. Alice watched her drink, watched the pale throat work as the liquid went down, watched and thought about how easy it would be. Just a little more of the powder, just a touch more of the seeds ground fine. But not yet. Not now. Revenge sweeter than freedom, the old folks said, but it had to be patient, had to be perfect. "That'll be all, Alice." "Yes, ma'am." Alice backed out of the room, eyes down, spine bent, playing the role she'd perfected over 22 years of breathing the air of Turner's place. But inside where her grandmother's spirit still whispered in the old tongue, where her own murdered children's voices called out for justice, where every whipping and rape and sale and cruelty had carved its mark. Inside, Alice was someone else entirely. Inside, she was the storm that was coming. That night, After the field hands stumbled back to the quarters bone-tired and soul-weary. After the meager supper of cornmeal mush and side meat so rancid it made your stomach hurt. After the children had cried themselves to sleep, and the old ones had prayed their prayers that seemed to bounce off heaven's door unanswered. After all that, Alice slipped out of her cabin. The moon hung low and fat in the sky, what folks called a conjure moon. Good for root work. Good for promises made in blood. She moved like a shadow through the quarters, past the cabin where the new girl slept, probably already violated by Willis's winning straw. Past old Bessie's place where snoring rattled the thin walls. Past the tool shed where the driver kept his whips. Into the woods she went, following a path only root doctors and conjure women knew. The night was alive with sounds, crickets singing, bullfrogs calling. Somewhere far off a dog howling at something it could sense but not see. Alice's feet knew the way even in darkness. Down to the creek where the water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. To the place where three paths met, where crossroads magic was strongest. She knelt in the soft mud at the water's edge and began to dig with her bare hands, pulled up roots, gathered smooth stones, filled her apron pockets with things that would matter soon. The whole time she sang under her breath, not a spiritual, not a work song, but something older, something her grandmother Eve had taught her in whispers, in the dead of night, in the language the white folks tried to beat out of them but couldn't kill. O Sunyin, hear me. Oya, witness this promise. Isu at the crossroads, carry my petition to the ancestors. When she was done, when her pockets were heavy and her hands were muddy and her heart was iron hard with purpose, Alice stood. She looked up at that fat moon and spoke one more time. 22 years I've been patient. 22 years I've been quiet. But the time is coming soon, when this place gonna know what judgment tastes like. The wind picked up then, rattling the leaves like bones. Somewhere far off, thunder rumbled, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Alice walked back to the quarters, back to her cabin, back to her narrow pallet where she lay down but didn't sleep. Just stared at the ceiling and counted the days, counted the hours, counted the breaths until the harvest feast that Massa Nathaniel was planning. 40 men, he'd said. 40 overseers and drivers and paddy rollers from all the nearby plantations. A celebration of control. A feast of power. Alice smiled in the darkness. 40 men, she thought. 40 seats at the table, 40 portions to prepare, 40 mouths to feed what they got coming. And somewhere in the night, if you listened close, you could hear it. A sound like a pot bubbling, like poison brewing, like the slow, steady heartbeat of vengeance finally waking up after sleeping too long. Now listen here, child. Before I tell you about Alice's rise, I gotta tell you about Alice's root. Because ain't no tree grow tall without deep foundations. And ain't no woman conjure death without learning from someone who survived worse than death. The year was 1792. Folks swear on their lives they seen the sky turn red that summer, like even heaven was bleeding. Over on the coast of what them white geographers called the Gold Coast, but what was really the Blood Coast, the Wailing Coast, the coast where nations died, there was a village. Small village with a name I won't speak here because some names carry too much weight, too much grief, and saying them out loud might crack the world open again. In that village lived a young woman named Adaize. That was her real name, her birth name, the name her mama whispered in her ear while she still had a mama to do the whispering. Adaize meant daughter of the king, but she wasn't no royalty. Just daughter of a farmer who grew yams and kept goats and knew the plants that healed and the roots that protected. Adaize was 16 years old, belly swollen 6 months with her first child, when the raiders came. They came at dawn when the mist was still heavy, when folks were just waking up and getting the cooking fires started. Came with guns and chains and no mercy in their hearts. Some of them black like her, sold their own people for cloth and rum and metal trinkets, and some of them white like ghosts, like death itself, walking upright and speaking languages that sounded like curses. Lord have mercy, the screaming that day. They took 87 people from that village, killed the old ones who couldn't walk fast, killed the men who tried to fight, killed the babies too young to survive the march to the coast. Adais watched her father fall with a bullet in his chest, watched her mother get clubbed in the head with a rifle butt for crying too loud. Then she was running, belly heavy, feet bleeding, chains around her neck connecting her to strangers who yesterday were neighbors, and now were just fellow sufferers in a long line of the damned. 3 weeks they marched. 3 weeks eating once a day if they were lucky, drinking from muddy streams, sleeping on hard ground while the chains cut into skin that swelled and wept and got infected. Women bled between their legs and couldn't stop. Men's backs split open from the whips. And always, always, that cursed shuffling sound of dozens of feet dragging through red dust, heading toward something worse than anything they could imagine. The Barracoon, that's what they called it. The white stone fortress where they kept us before loading us onto the ships. The Barracoon on Gorée Island was hell with walls. Dark cells packed so tight you couldn't lie down. Just lean against other bodies and try not to suffocate in the heat and the stink and the despair that hung thick as smoke. Adaizi spent 6 weeks there. 6 weeks watching people die and get dragged out and replaced by fresh captives who still had hope in their eyes. That hope died quick. The root doctor who lived in that Barracoon, old woman so bent she looked like a question mark, with scars across her face that marked her as Igbo nobility. She saw something in Adaizi, saw past the swollen belly and the vacant eyes and the spirit that seemed broken beyond repair. "You still got life in that womb," the old woman whispered in their shared language. "That child coming soon. You need to survive for them. You hear me, daughter?" "Why?" Adaizi's voice came out like rocks grinding. "Why survive for this?" The old woman's hands, twisted with age and hard use, reached out and touched Adaizi's belly. "Because memory is a weapon too. Because somebody got to carry forward what they trying to kill. And because..." Her eyes went distant, seeing something beyond the stone walls. "Because I dreamed about you. Dreamed your belly child gonna birth a warrior. Not the kind that fights with spears. The kind that fights with knowledge, with roots, with patience sharp as any blade." She pressed something into Adaizi's hand. Seeds. Tiny seeds wrapped in a scrap of cloth. These came from deep forest. Sacred forest where the Orisha still walk. You plant these in whatever cursed land they take you to. You nurture them, and when the time comes, when someone need them, these seeds gonna give your people a weapon the white folk can't chain. Adaizi wanted to throw them away, wanted to throw herself into the ocean when they loaded her onto that ship. But something, maybe stubbornness, maybe the baby kicking in her womb, maybe the old woman's words echoing in her skull, made her hold tight to those seeds. That land carried heavy spirits, they say about the Middle Passage, but even that ain't strong enough words for what happened on them ships. The ship was called Fortitude. White folks love naming their death ships after virtues they ain't never practiced. It left Gorée in September 1792, packed with 437 souls in a space meant for maybe 200. The hold, the place where they kept us, was dark, like the inside of a coffin, low-ceilinged so you couldn't stand up, just lay there chained to the people on either side of you, breathing air so foul it burned your lungs. Adaizi was down there, belly huge now, baby due any week. The chains rubbed her ankles raw. The wood beneath her was slick with blood and vomit and waste because they didn't let you up, but once a day. And sometimes not even that. She could hear people dying, could feel them dying beside her, bodies going cold while they were still chained to the living. The baby came in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the night, in the middle of screaming that nobody answered. Adaizi gave birth lying on her side, chained at ankle and wrist with only the woman next to her. Stranger whose name she never learned, trying to help. No midwife, no clean cloth, no prayers except the ones Adaizi gasped between contractions. The pain was suffering so bad she thought death would be mercy, but death didn't come. The baby did. A girl. Tiny, smaller than she should be, skin darker than midnight, crying with lungs that somehow still believed in life even after being born into this floating grave. The woman beside Adaizi bit through the cord with her own teeth since they had no knife. used a corner of her own torn dress to wipe the baby clean, then pressed her close to Adaizi's chest. "She alive," the woman whispered in Twi. "You both alive. That's something. That's enough for today." They named her Eve in that darkness. Named her Eve because she was the mother of something new, something that would survive. The slavers, when they dragged Adaiz up on deck the next day to see if she was still worth keeping, they just wrote "wench" and "pickaninny" in their ledger. Didn't care enough to ask names. 53 days that ship took to cross the ocean. 53 days of horror I ain't got words harsh enough to describe. 142 people died on that crossing and got thrown overboard like garbage. The sharks followed the ship the whole way, growing fat on black bodies. But Adaiz survived, and Eve survived. And those seeds wrapped in cloth and hidden in the only place a woman could hide something when she was naked, and watched every moment. Those seeds survived too. They landed in Charleston in November, when the air was turning cold. The auction block was made of old wood, worn smooth by thousands of feet that had stood there before, waiting to be sold like horses or furniture. Adaiz stood there with Eve clutched to her chest, 7 weeks old and still nursing, both of them naked as the day God made them because the white folks wanted buyers to see the merchandise clear. A man named Jonathan Turner bought them, farmer from Virginia, looking for breeding stock. Paid $400 for both. Adaiz didn't know what that meant. Didn't know that she'd just become property worth less than a decent horse, but more than a plow. Didn't know she was being taken to a plantation called Turner's Place, where she'd spend the next 17 years surviving. They changed her name. Called her Eve, same as they'd named her daughter because white folks couldn't be bothered to learn real names. So the mother became Eve Sr., and the daughter stayed Eve. But at night, in the slave quarters when nobody was watching, Adaizi taught her daughter her real name, taught her the language they tried to beat out of her, taught her the songs and the prayers and the names of the Orisha that still lived even in this cursed land. And those seeds, she planted them behind the cabin in a spot where nobody paid attention, watered them with her tears and her blood and her prayers. They grew into beautiful plants with white bell-shaped flowers that the mistress admired and wanted to pick for the big house. "No, ma'am," Eve Sr. said quietly. "Them plants is poisonous. Kill you dead if you touch them wrong." The mistress left them alone after that. Years passed. Eve Sr. got pregnant 4 more times by 4 different men. Never asked, never wanted, just taken. 2 babies lived, a boy they named Isaac and another girl they called Ruth. The other 2 died before they could walk, and maybe that was mercy. She worked the kitchen, learned to cook food she'd never tasted before she was stolen, learned to speak English good enough to understand orders, and bad enough that white folks thought she was simple, learned to smile when her back was bleeding from the lash, learned to say yes massa and no ma'am, and swallow her rage until it turned to stone in her belly. But at night, she taught her children, taught them the old ways, taught young Eve about roots and herbs, about which ones healed and which ones killed, taught her the prayers to Osanyan, the Orisha of medicine and forest knowledge, taught her that knowledge was a kind of freedom, even when your body was in chains. "One day," she'd whisper to Eve in the dark, "one day our people gonna need this knowledge, gonna need to know how to fight back with what they can't see, can't chain, can't take from us. You remember what I teach you, daughter. You remember, and when the time comes, you use it." Young Eve grew up strong and quiet, learning everything her mother taught her. By the time she was 15, she could identify every plant in Virginia by its leaves and its smell, could tell you which roots would bring down a fever and which would bring down a man, could mix a poultice that would heal a whip wound or a powder that would stop a heart. She was 17 when her mother died. Just wore out, used up, worked to death at 34 years old. They buried Eve Sr. in the slave cemetery, just a plot of bare earth with no marker, no stone, nothing to say that a queen's daughter had been laid there. But young Eve remembered, took some of the sacred dirt and put it in a pouch around her neck, took cuttings from the poison plants her mother had grown, kept the knowledge alive. 2 years later, at 19, Eve gave birth to her own daughter. The father was one of the field hands, a good man named Solomon who sang like an angel, and got sold away before the baby was born. Eve named the baby Alice because the mistress had been reading some book and liked the name, and it was easier to go along than to fight over it. But in secret, in the quiet of night, Eve whispered the real name in her daughter's ear, Adaisi, same name her grandmother had carried across the ocean. Daughter of the king. Because even in bondage, even in suffering something terrible, even in this place where they treated us worse than animals, we were still royalty, still carried kingdoms in our blood. Eve raised Alice the same way she'd been raised, taught her the plants, taught her the prayers, taught her the old language, what little she remembered, taught her that patience was a kind of power, and memory was a kind of weapon, and there were some things they couldn't take from you no matter how many chains they put on your body. Remember who you are, Eve would say, holding little Alice close. Remember who your grandmother was. Remember that you come from people who survived the unspeakable. And remember that surviving ain't the same as giving up. Sometimes surviving is the first step toward rising up. Alice listened. Alice learned. Alice remembered. And when Eve died in 1831, worn out at 40 years old, just like her mother before her, Alice stood at the grave and made a promise. Made it to her mother's spirit. Made it to her grandmother's memory. Made it to all the ancestors who'd survived the ships and the chains and the endless cruelty. I won't die quiet, she whispered to the red Virginia dirt. I won't die empty-handed. I won't die without making them pay for what they done. The seeds her great-grandmother had carried across the ocean were still growing behind Alice's cabin. The knowledge passed down through 3 generations was still alive in her hands. And the rage, Lord of Glory, the rage was alive in her heart, burning slow and patient like good coals that wait for the right moment to become fire. That moment was coming. Alice could feel it in her bones, in her blood, in the very marrow of her being. Could feel it in the way the wind changed direction. Could feel it in the way the moon hung heavy in the sky. Could feel it in the way the ancestors whispered in her dreams. Soon, they said. Soon, daughter. Soon you gonna feed them what they got coming. Soon you gonna show them that even a woman in chains can bring judgment down like thunder from heaven. Alice was ready, had been getting ready her whole life, had been preparing for this since before she was born, since her great-grandmother first closed her hands around those sacred seeds in a barracoon on Goree Island. The weapon had been passed down through Middle Passage and auction block, through whipping post and slave quarters, through 3 generations of women who survived what should have killed them. Now it was Alice's turn to use it. Now it was time for Turner's Place to learn that some debts come due, even when you think you got away with everything. Now it was time for the harvest. And the harvest, children, was going to be bitter as gall and sweet as long-awaited justice, all mixed together in one big pot that Alice the cook was going to serve up to 40 men who thought they were untouchable. In them days of deep sorrow, the old song goes, but it also says, My Lord delivered Daniel, and why not every man? Alice was about to answer that question her own way. Listen here one last time, children, because every story got to end, but some endings are really beginnings, and some deaths are really seeds planted deep that take generations to bloom, but bloom they do, fierce and beautiful and impossible to kill. It's a cold November night in 2025, almost 200 years to the day since Alice the cook served her feast of judgment. Somewhere in Virginia, not far from where Turner's Place used to stand before time and shame tore it down, an old woman sits by a fire in a small house that her great-great-grandfather built after emancipation. Built on land he bought with money he earned as a free man. Built with hands that had once been property, but learned to be power. Her name is Ruth, named for Alice's daughter, the baby stolen to nurse white children. And she's 93 years old, bent with age but sharp as broken glass. And tonight she's telling the story. Again. Always again. Because some stories can't be told just once and be done. Some stories need repeating the way breath needs repeating, the way heartbeats need repeating, the way memory needs repeating, or it dies. Around her sit her grandchildren and great-grandchildren and a few neighbors who came because they heard old Ruth was telling tonight. And when old Ruth tells, you listen. You pull up a chair, you lean in close. You let the words wash over you like baptism water or hurricane rain, and you remember. Alice the cook, Ruth begins, her voice cracked but strong, carrying the weight of all the tellings that came before. Y'all know the story, but do you know what it means? The children shake their heads. They know the outline. Woman poisoned masters, got hanged, became legend. But the meaning? That's deeper water. It means, Ruth says, that our people been fighting back longer than history books admit. Means that resistance don't always look like Nat Turner with an axe or Harriet Tubman with a gun. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a kitchen, patient and planning, using the only weapon she got. Her knowledge, her courage, and her absolute refusal to accept that suffering is all we deserve. She pauses, lets that settle in. Outside, the wind picks up, rattling the windows like it's trying to get in, like it's carrying voices from across the years. But here's the thing nobody tells you about Alice's story, Ruth continues. Here's the part that matters most. She knew she was gonna die. Knew it from the moment she started planning. Knew that poisoning 40 white men in 1831 Virginia wasn't something you walked away from, and she did it anyway. Why? A young girl asks. Can't be more than 10, eyes wide and serious. If she knew she'd die, why do it? Ruth smiles, and it's Alice's smile, passed down through blood and story and the stubborn refusal to forget. Because some things are worse than dying, baby. Living on your knees is worse. Watching your children get sold and doing nothing is worse. Being violated and staying silent is worse. Alice decided that if she was gonna die anyway, and all enslaved folks were dying, slow or fast, body or soul, then she was gonna die fighting. Gonna die making them pay, gonna die proving that black women ain't property, ain't passive, ain't powerless. She looks around the room at the faces watching her. Young and old, light and dark, all of them carrying Alice's blood in their veins. All of them alive because Alice survived long enough to have children who survived long enough to have children who survived long enough to be free. And here we are, Ruth says softly. Free, not because one woman poisoned 40 men, but because thousands of people like Alice, famous and forgotten, remembered and lost, they all fought back in their own ways. Some loud, some quiet, some with weapons, some with words, some with silence that spoke louder than screaming. They all added up. They all mattered. They all brought us here. The fire crackles. Someone coughs. The wind keeps singing its old song outside. So when you cook tomorrow, Ruth tells them, when you go to work, when you navigate this world that still don't always treat us fair, remember Alice. Remember that you come from people who survived the unsurvivable, who resisted the inevitable, who turned kitchens into battlefields and suffering into strength and chains into crowns. She reaches into her apron pocket, because even at 93, Ruth still wears an apron, still cooks Sunday dinners, still feeds her family with the same hands that carry Alice's legacy, and pulls out a small cloth pouch. My grandmother gave this to me, Ruth says. Said it came from Alice herself, seeds from the plants she used, not to poison with, Lord, no, but to remember, to plant in our gardens, to look at and know. Beauty and danger can grow from the same root. Love and revolution can come from the same hands. We contain multitudes, children. We always have. She passes the pouch around. Each person touches it, feels the weight of seeds that have survived 200 years, seeds that connect them to a woman they never met but will never forget. One more thing, Ruth says as the pouch comes back to her. Alice's last words. The Psalm 23 she recited while they hanged her. Folks say she kept speaking even after the rope should have killed her. Some call it miracle, some call it legend, some call it impossible. What do you call it? The young girl asks. Ruth's eyes gleam in the firelight. I call it proof. Proof that some voices can't be silenced. Some truths won't die. Some stories need telling until the words themselves become immortal. She stands then, slower than she used to, but still standing. Still here, still carrying the story forward. Y'all go on home now. Go cook your meals. Go live your lives. But remember, every time you tie on an apron, every time you stir a pot, every time you feed the people you love, you doing Alice's work. You keeping her alive. You proving that the powerless can become powerful, that knowledge is inheritance, that memory is weapon and shield both. The gathering breaks up slow. People hug Ruth, thank her, promise to come back next year for the telling. Because it's tradition now, has been for generations. Every November, on the anniversary of the feast, old Ruth tells the story. And every year, the listeners carry it forward, plant it in new soil, watch it grow. Ruth stands at her door watching them go, watching taillights disappear into the darkness. Behind her, the fire burns low. Around her, the house settles into night sounds. Above her, the same stars Alice looked at shine down, constant and cold and beautiful. I told it again, Alice. Ruth whispers to the darkness, to the ancestors, to the woman who died so others could live with dignity. Told it like my grandmother taught me, like her grandmother taught her, like your spirit taught us all. That resistance is breath, that memory is life, that stories are the way we survive death itself. The wind answers, carrying something that might be words, or might be song, or might be the eternal echo of a woman reciting psalms with a rope around her neck, teaching us all that the last word belongs not to the oppressor, but to the ones who refuse to be silenced. And that, children, is where I leave you tonight. With Alice's name on your tongues and her courage in your hearts and the understanding that every meal you cook, every story you tell, every moment you stand tall despite the weight trying to bend you, it's all connected to her, to them, to everyone who came before and made it possible for you to be here now. The table has turned. The feast is over. But the echoes, Lord have mercy, the echoes go on forever. Because some stories don't end. They just keep beginning over and over in every kitchen, every heart, every voice raised in testimony. Remember Alice the cook. Tell her story. Live her courage. And when you taste freedom, even the bittersweet freedom we got now, know that she seasoned it first with patience and poison, with love and rage, with everything she had and everything she was. The ones who suffered, they suffered. The ones who resisted, they left us memory. And memory, sweet Jesus, memory we keep alive here in the quarters of our hearts, in the kitchens of our souls, in the stories we tell when the fire burns low and the night closes in. Here, always here, in the echoes from the quarters. Amen, Axe. And so it shall be forever and ever, until every chain is broken and every story is told, and every Alice gets her justice. Sweet Jesus, there are some days that cut your soul in half, and you spend the rest of your life walking around with the wound still bleeding fresh. The day they sold Isaiah was that kind of day for Alice. Was the day something inside her died, and something else, something cold and patient and absolutely merciless, was born in its place. Alice was 17 years old that summer of 1826. Still young enough to hope, still fool enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, if she worked hard and kept her head down and did everything right, they might leave her boy alone. Isaiah was 7 years old, with eyes big as the full moon, and a smile that could make even old Aunt Bessie laugh after a hard day in the fields. He had his daddy's gentle spirit, Solomon, the man they'd sold away before the baby was even born, and his mama's quick mind. The child could count to 100, could recognize his letters from watching the white children's lessons through the big house windows, could sing spirituals in a voice so pure it made grown men cry. Alice had taught him everything she could, sneaking moments of learning between the endless cooking and cleaning and serving. Taught him to be smart but act simple around white folks. Taught him to survive. But survival don't mean nothing when a white man needs money. It was a Tuesday morning in August, hot as perdition, when Massa Turner came into the kitchen where Alice was making breakfast. The air was thick with the smell of frying side meat and corn pone, and Alice was humming one of the old songs her mama taught her. She looked up when she heard his boots on the floorboards, and something in his face made her insides turn to ice. "Alice," he said, not meeting her eyes because even devils got shame sometimes. I need you to fetch Isaiah. Bring him to the yard." Time stopped. The whole world went silent except for the sound of her own heart beating loud as drums in her chest. She knew. Lord have mercy, she knew what that meant. Had seen it happen to other mothers a dozen times. Had held them while they screamed and wept and called out names of children who would never answer again. "Massa." Her voice came out steady even though everything inside her was shattering. "Please, sir, he just a baby, I done made up my mind, Alice." Turner's face hardened. "Got debts to pay. Man from South Carolina heading to the auction block in Richmond, and he's paying good money for young stock. Isaiah's healthy, and he'll bring a fair price. Massa, I'll work harder." Alice dropped to her knees right there on the kitchen floor, something she swore to her mama's memory she'd never do. "I'll work day and night, Get up, Alice." His voice was cold. "And fetch the boy. Don't make me send the overseer." She got up. What choice did she have? Got up on legs that didn't want to hold her, walked across the yard on feet that felt like they were stepping through broken glass, went to the quarters where Isaiah was playing with the other children, making little horses out of corn husks and laughing that sweet laugh that was about to get stolen from the world. "Mama!" He ran to her when he saw her face. "Mama, what's wrong?" Alice knelt down and pulled him close, breathing in the smell of him, sweat and red clay and that particular scent that was just Isaiah, just her baby, just the best thing that ever happened in her cursed life. She wanted to run, wanted to grab him and flee to the woods, to the swamps, to anywhere that wasn't here. But where could a black woman and a child run to in Virginia in 1826? The paddy rollers would hunt them down. The dogs would tear them apart. And even if by some miracle they made it north, how would they survive? "Mama's got to take you somewhere," she whispered into his hair. "I need you to be brave, baby. Need you to be strong like I taught you. Where we going?" His eyes were so trusting, so innocent, it nearly broke her right there. Just come with me." She led him across the yard, his small hand in hers, knowing that every step was taking them closer to the moment when that hand would be ripped away forever. Took him to where Massa Turner waited with the slave trader, a fat white man with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes like a snake. "This the boy?" The trader walked around Isaiah like he was inspecting a horse, grabbed his arm, pried open his mouth to check his teeth, felt his legs and back. "Good bones. Healthy. Yeah, he'll do. I can get 300 for him, easy." "Mama!" Isaiah's voice was small and scared now. He'd figured it out. Children always do. "Mama, I don't want to go." Alice couldn't speak, couldn't make words come out past the stone in her throat. Just held his hand tighter while the trader counted out money into Massa Turner's palm. 30 pieces of silver, $300, the price of her son. "Time to go, boy." The trader grabbed Isaiah's other arm. That's when Alice's voice came roaring back like a storm. "Isaiah! Isaiah! You remember who you are? You remember everything I taught you. You remember your name." The trader yanked Isaiah toward the wagon. The boy was crying now, reaching back toward her. "Mama, Mama, don't let them take me, Mama." Alice tried to run after them. Made it 3 steps before the overseer. Willis, the same Willis who would one day violate her own body, grabbed her and threw her to the ground. She scrambled up, screaming her son's name, and Willis hit her. Hit her so hard she tasted blood. Hit her again when she tried to get up. By the 3rd blow, she was on the ground with her mouth split open and blood pouring down her chin. Through the haze of pain, she saw the wagon pulling away, saw Isaiah's face in the back, tears streaming, little hand stretched out toward her. Saw him mouth the word "Mama" one last time before the wagon turned onto the road and disappeared into the dust. Alice lay there in the red Virginia clay while the blood from her mouth mixed with the dirt. Lay there while the other enslaved folks came and lifted her up gentle as they could, while they carried her back to the quarters, while they tried to comfort her with words that meant nothing because there's no comfort for a mother whose child has been stolen. For 3 days she didn't speak, didn't eat, just lay on her pallet staring at nothing. On the 4th day she got up, washed her face, went back to the kitchen, started cooking again like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Everything had changed. That night, Alice went to the woods, went to the place where her mama's grave was, where her grandma was buried before that. Knelt in the dirt and dug with her bare hands until she found what she was looking for. The root her mama had shown her, the one that grew deep and twisted, the one that her great-grandma had brought from Africa. She pulled it up, dirt and all, and held it in her hands, and she made a promise to the ancestors, to the Orisha, to every spirit that was listening in that dark wood under that merciless moon. "One day," she whispered, "one day I'm gonna feed them poison. One day I'm gonna watch them die choking on what I served them. One day they gonna pay for every child they stole, every mother they broke, every soul they destroyed." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves like the ancestors were listening, like they were saying yes, like they were saying we remember, like they were saying when you're ready, we'll be there. Alice stood up, brushed the dirt from her dress, and walked back to the quarters with that root hidden in her apron. She had started counting, started planning, started preparing for a reckoning that might take years, but would come as sure as Judgment Day. 'Cause some debts got to be paid, and some mothers don't never stop being mothers, even when their babies are 1,000 miles away, even when the world says they got no right to rage, even when every law and custom says they're supposed to just accept it and move on. Alice wasn't moving on. Alice was moving toward something, toward a day when the table would turn and the feast would be poison and the mighty would fall. Isaiah's name was carved into her heart like words on a tombstone. And every day she lived, every breath she took, was one step closer to making sure the men who stole him would regret the day they were born. The old ones warned us, revenge is a meal best served cold. But Alice's revenge was going to be hot as hellfire and just as permanent. Now you got to understand something about grief, children. It don't never really leave. It just finds a corner inside you and sits there, waiting. And sometimes when life tricks you into hoping again, that grief wakes up and reminds you that joy and pain walk together in this world, holding hands like old friends. 2 years after they sold Isaiah, Alice found out she was pregnant again. She was 19 years old, working in the kitchen like always when the sickness started. That particular morning sickness that every woman knows, that tells you something new is growing inside, even when you ain't sure if you got room in your heart for more breaking. Alice stood over the wash bucket behind the kitchen house, emptying her stomach, and she knew. The father was a man named Josiah from the neighboring plantation. Good man, strong man, with hands scarred from fieldwork and eyes that still held kindness despite everything this world had done to him. He'd been hired out to Turner's place for a few months to help with the harvest, and in those stolen moments, Sunday afternoons when the work stopped for a few hours, nights when they could slip away to the edge of the woods, something gentle had grown between them. "I love you, Alice," he'd told her once, holding her face in his calloused hands. "I know we ain't allowed to love. No, they can take it away any minute, but I love you anyway." She'd believed him. Fool that she was, she'd let herself hope again. When she told him about the baby, his face lit up like sunrise. "We gonna have a child?" He pressed his hand to her still flat belly. "Alice, that's a blessing. That's hope." "Hope." Alice said the word like it was foreign, like she'd forgotten its taste. Hope, just another word for something they can steal. "Not this time," Josiah said with the confidence of a man who hadn't yet learned that white folks didn't need reasons, just wanted excuses. "This time's gonna be different." But different never comes to those in bondage. They sold Josiah back to his home plantation 3 weeks later. Just routine business, they said. His time at Turner's place was done. Alice watched him go, pregnant with his child, and didn't even get to say goodbye proper. Just watched his back disappearing down the road, watched him look back once with eyes full of regret and love and helplessness. She never saw him again. Heard later, years later, that he'd tried to run north, tried to buy his freedom, tried everything. Heard he died somewhere in Kentucky, body found by the roadside, whether from cold or hunger or a bullet, nobody could say. But by then Alice's heart was so scarred over that the news just settled on top of all the other grief, like another layer of dirt on an old grave. The baby grew despite everything. Alice worked through the pregnancy, cooking and cleaning and serving, her belly swelling month by month. The other women in the quarters watched over her when they could. Old Bessie made her sit down when the work got too hard. Young Dinah brought her extra portions of cornbread when nobody was looking. Even the men, the few who had any tenderness left in them after years of being treated like beasts, they'd carry heavy pots for her, chop the wood she needed for the fire, small mercies that kept her going. The birth came in March of 1829, on a night when the rain fell so hard it sounded like the sky was weeping. Alice labored in her cabin with only Bessie and 2 other women to help. No doctor, because doctors didn't come for enslaved women. No medicine, because medicine cost money, and money wasn't wasted on property that could be replaced. "Push, child," Bessie commanded, her old hands steady and sure. "Push like you pushing all this pain out. Push like you bringing life into a world that tried to kill it." Alice pushed through pain that felt like her body was splitting in half. Pushed through the memory of Isaiah's face disappearing in that wagon. Pushed through every hurt and loss and violation that had carved its mark on her soul. And finally, she felt the baby slip free. "It's a girl!" Bessie's voice cracked with emotion. "Alice, you got a daughter." They cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a scrap of blanket worn soft from years of use. Placed her in Alice's arms, and Alice looked down at the tiny face. Eyes closed, mouth working, perfect and fragile, and already marked for suffering, just by being born black and enslaved in Virginia in 1829. "Ruth," Alice whispered. The name came to her like a gift, like something the ancestors sent. Ruth from the Bible. Ruth who stayed loyal even when everything was lost. Ruth who survived and found redemption. "Her name is Ruth." "That's a good name," Bessie said softly. "A strong name for a strong girl." For 2 years, Ruth was the light in Alice's darkness. The baby grew into a toddler, round-cheeked and curious, with eyes that sparkled when she laughed and hands that reached for everything, wanting to touch and know and understand the world around her. Alice taught her songs in the old language, whispered stories about her Grandma Eve and great-grandma Adais who'd crossed the ocean pregnant and afraid but still alive. Taught her to say her name, not just Ruth, but the name behind the name, the real name that white folks couldn't touch. At night, after the work was done and the quarters were quiet except for snoring and soft crying and whispered prayers, Alice would hold Ruth close and sing, "Thula, thula, thula baba, thula sana lwandle ulale, thula, thula, thula baba, thula sana lwandle ulale." Didn't matter that it was Ijosa, and Alice barely remembered where she'd learned it, passed down through generations until the meaning was lost. But the melody remained. It was a lullaby, a blessing, a prayer for safety in a world that offered none. Ruth would fall asleep against her mama's chest, and Alice would feel something crack open inside her. Not the breaking kind of crack, but the kind that lets light in. The kind that reminds you that love is possible even in hell, that beauty can grow even in cursed soil, that sometimes miracles come in the form of a child's breathing against your heartbeat. But white folks don't let black mothers have peace for long. Ruth was 2 years old when the mistress of the neighboring plantation, a woman named Mrs. Whitmore who'd just given birth to twins, came calling. She needed a wet nurse because her own milk had dried up, and she'd heard that Alice had a healthy child still nursing. "That gal of yours," Mrs. Whitmore said to Massa Turner, while Alice stood in the corner of the parlor, holding Ruth tight. "I need her milk for my babies. You let me borrow her, I'll pay you good." Alice's blood turned to ice water. She knew what borrow meant. Knew it meant they'd take Ruth, force her to nurse white babies while her own child starved. Knew it meant her daughter would grow up in another plantation, another set of quarters, another world where Alice couldn't protect her. "Ruth still nursing," Alice spoke up without permission, desperate. "She need her mama's milk, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore looked at Alice like she was a dog that had barked out of turn. Your pickaninny can eat mush like the rest of them. My babies need proper nourishment. Alice. Massa Turner's voice was a warning. You'll do as Mrs. Whitmore requires. It's only for a year or so until her twins are weaned. A year. Might as well be forever. Might as well be death. They took Ruth the next morning. Just walked into the quarters, plucked her from Alice's arms while the child screamed, "Mama! Mama!" in a voice that would haunt Alice's dreams for the rest of her life. Carried her away to nurse white babies while Alice's breasts ached and leaked milk that had nowhere to go. This time Alice didn't fight, didn't run after the wagon, didn't scream. Just stood there in the doorway of her cabin watching her second child disappear, feeling the last piece of her heart turn to stone. That night, she went to her garden. The plants her great-grandma had brought from Africa were blooming, white flowers that smelled sweet but held death in their seeds. Alice knelt beside them and whispered, "I'm ready now. Show me how to make the poison strong. Show me how to cook judgment into every meal. Show me how to feed them their own cruelty." And in the darkness, she swore she heard her mama's voice. "Patience, daughter. Your time is coming. Keep counting. Keep preparing. One day you'll get both your babies back, or you'll make sure the ones who stole them pay so dearly that hell itself will seem like mercy." Alice went back to her cabin, went back to cooking, went back to surviving. But inside, where her soul used to be soft, there was only iron now. Only cold purpose. Only the slow-burning fire of a mother's rage that nothing, not time, not fear, not even death could extinguish. Ruth and Isaiah, two names carved so deep into her heart that they might as well be written in her bones. And one day, when the harvest feast came around and 40 men sat at Massa Turner's table, Alice would serve them a meal seasoned with every tear she'd cried, every night she'd lain awake calling her children's names, every moment of agony that white folks thought she was too simple to feel. Folks swear on their lives that a mother's curse is the strongest magic there is. Alice was about to prove them right. "Listen here, child, because this is the part where I got to tell you something that ain't got no pretty words for it. This is where I got to speak on the kind of violence that white folks pretended didn't happen, that they wrote out of their history books, that they called by gentle names like relations or liaisons, when what it really was war waged on black women's bodies every single night. The moon was full that night in June of 1830. One of them conjure moons that makes everything sharper, clearer, like the spirits are watching extra close. Alice was 21 years old, worn down to bone and gristle from grief and work and surviving. Ruth had been gone for 4 months. Isaiah had been gone for 4 years. Every day was just putting one foot in front of the other, breathing because stopping wasn't allowed, living because dying would have been too easy an escape. She'd finished in the kitchen late that night. The mistress had had guests and there were extra dishes to scrub, extra pots to scour, extra silver to polish until her hands were raw. It was past midnight when Alice finally crossed the yard toward the quarters, her feet dragging, her whole body aching with that bone-deep tiredness that comes from being worked like a mule from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. She didn't hear him coming. That's what Willis was good at, moving quiet when he was hunting. He was 23 years old, the youngest overseer on Turner's place, with yellow hair that he wore long and eyes the color of dirty ice. He'd been watching Alice for months, making comments when she passed, touching her arm when he handed her instructions, standing too close when she served food at the big house. Alice had been avoiding him, keeping her eyes down, her movements quick, always making sure she wasn't alone. But that night, tired and grieving and not paying attention like she should have been, she didn't see him step out from behind the smokehouse until it was too late. "Well, well," his voice came out slow and thick with whiskey. "Alice, been waiting for you." She tried to run, made it 3 steps before he caught her by the hair and yanked her backward so hard she saw stars. Her head hit the ground and the world tilted, spinning like she'd been thrown off the edge of everything solid. "Please," she heard herself say, hating the word even as it left her mouth. "Please, sir, I gotta get to the quarters, they waiting for me." "Nobody waiting for you." Willis dropped down on top of her. his weight crushing the air from her lungs. His breath stank of rot-gut whiskey and tobacco and something rotten underneath. And even if they was, ain't nobody gonna stop me. You understand that? You're property, Alice. You don't say no to white men, she fought. Lord have mercy, she fought. Scratched at his face until she drew blood, tried to scream until he clamped his hand over her mouth so hard she tasted blood from her split lip. Kicked and twisted and did everything she could. But he was stronger, heavier, and the world had already decided whose body belonged to who. What happened next? I ain't gonna describe it in detail because some things are too heavy to speak, too cruel to give words to. But you need to know it happened. Need to know that this was the reality for black women under slavery. Your body wasn't yours. Your no didn't mean nothing. Your tears, your pain, your humanity. All of it was invisible to men who'd been taught that black women were just another kind of livestock to use however they pleased. When it was over, Willis stood up and adjusted his clothes like he'd just finished a normal day's work. Looked down at Alice lying there in the dirt, dress torn, blood running down her thighs. Spirit shattered into pieces she didn't know how to gather back together. You tell anybody about this, he said, his voice flat and cold. And I'll whip every woman in them quarters until the ground runs red. You understand me? Alice didn't answer, couldn't answer. Just lay there staring up at that full moon, that conjure moon, wondering where all the spirits were, where all the ancestors had gone, why nobody had stopped this. After Willis walked away whistling like he'd done nothing wrong, Alice lay there for a long time. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. Time didn't work right anymore. Finally, she pushed herself up. Every part of her hurt, body, soul, every place in between that had no name. She limped toward the creek that ran behind the quarters, the one where folks washed clothes and fetched water, and sometimes baptized their babies when the overseer wasn't watching. Alice walked into that cold water fully clothed, let it rise up to her waist, her chest, her neck. Part of her wanted to keep walking, wanted to let the current take her down into the darkness where nothing could hurt anymore. But something stopped her. Maybe stubbornness, maybe rage, maybe the memory of her mama's voice saying, "Survive, daughter. Survive until you can do more than survive." She stood there in that creek under that mocking moon and washed herself, scrubbed her skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the violation, the shame, the feeling of being less than human. The water ran pink with blood around her legs, and Alice watched it flow downstream, watched it disappear into the darkness, and something inside her went cold. Not broken, cold. There's a difference. She climbed out of that creek a different woman than the one who'd walked in, went back to her cabin, changed into a dry dress, and sat on the edge of her pallet while the other women in the cabin pretended to sleep. But she knew they were listening, knew they'd heard or guessed what had happened, knew they were probably praying for her or crying quiet tears because what happened to one happened to all of them. Eventually, Alice didn't cry, didn't pray, just sat there in the darkness and thought about poison. Thought about the plants growing behind her cabin, thought about the knowledge her mama had passed down, thought about how easy it would be to put something in Willis's food, something that would make him die slow and painful, something that would make him suffer the way he'd made her suffer. But not yet. Not just him. Because Willis wasn't the only demon at Turner's place. Wasn't the only man who thought black women were his to violate. Wasn't even the worst of them, just the most recent. No, when Alice moved, she'd move big. When she struck, she'd strike all of them at once. Every overseer, every driver, every white man who'd participated in this system of horror. She'd feed them all, feed them well, and then she'd watch them die knowing exactly who'd killed them and why. "I'm gonna cook for you, Willis," she whispered into the darkness. "Gonna cook you the finest meal you ever ate, and it's gonna be the last thing you ever taste." The next morning, Alice got up before dawn like always, washed her face in the basin, tied her head wrap, walked across that yard to the kitchen house with her back straight and her face empty of everything except obedience. Willis was there, eating breakfast at the outdoor table with 3 other overseers. He looked up when she passed, smirked, said something to his companions that made them laugh. Alice didn't react, didn't flinch, just kept walking. But inside where the ancestors lived, inside where her rage had turned to something colder and more patient than anger, inside where she was already counting and planning and preparing, inside, Alice smiled. "Your time is coming," she thought, watching Willis shove bacon into his mouth. "Keep eating, keep taking, keep thinking you're untouchable, because the day I serve you your last meal, you're gonna finally understand that some debts come due and some sins can't be forgiven, only avenged." She went into the kitchen, started the fire, began cooking breakfast for the people who owned her body, but couldn't touch her will. And with every stir of the spoon, every chop of the knife, every moment of forced obedience, Alice was really doing something else. She was sharpening herself into a weapon. She was becoming judgment. She was preparing to be the answer to every prayer that had ever gone unanswered in the slave quarters. Soon, the ancestors whispered in the smoke rising from her cooking fire. "Soon, daughter, your time is almost here. Now you got to understand, children, that by the summer of 1831, something was stirring in the air across Virginia, something that made white folks nervous and black folks hopeful, even though hope was dangerous as dynamite. Rumors ran through the slave quarters like wildfire through dry grass, whispered in the fields, passed along in the hush harbors where we gathered to pray in secret. A preacher named Nat Turner, over in Southampton County, not far from where Alice lived, was having visions, seeing signs in the sky, hearing the voice of God telling him that the time had come for the enslaved to rise up, to take their freedom in blood and fire if that's what it required. The old ones warned us about men like Nat Turner, warned us they came along once in a generation, burning with righteousness and fury, ready to wage war against the powers of darkness. Some called them prophets, some called them madmen, but everybody knew that when such a man appeared, the world was about to shake. Alice first heard about it in late July from a man named Moses who'd been hired out from a neighboring plantation. He came to the kitchen for water one afternoon, looked around to make sure no white folks were listening, and leaned in close. "You heard about the preacher?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "The one they calling Black Moses?" Alice's hands didn't stop chopping the vegetables in front of her. I heard whispers, nothing solid. "He's saying the spirits told him, saying there's signs in the heavens. The sun turned dark back in February, you remember? Saying that was God's signal that the time of judgment is at hand." Moses's eyes were bright with something between hope and terror. "Saying that we got to strike back, Alice. Got to fight for our freedom instead of waiting for white folks to give it to us." "Fools talk," Alice said, but her heart was beating faster. "Get us all killed." "Maybe." Moses took a long drink of water. "But maybe dying free is better than living in chains. You ever think about that?" Alice didn't answer, but she thought about it. Lord knows she thought about it every single day. The uprising came on August 22nd, 1831. Started in the dead of night when Nat Turner and 6 other men went to the home of Turner's master and killed everyone inside. Then they moved from plantation to plantation, gathering more followers, striking down white folks with axes and hatchets and clubs, taking horses and guns, growing from 7 men to 70 in the space of a few hours. The news reached Turner's place 2 days later, brought by a white rider who came galloping up the road like death itself was chasing him. "Insurrection!" he screamed. "Slave rebellion! Nat Turner's army is killing white families in their beds." Great God Almighty, the panic that followed. Massa Turner and all the overseers armed themselves to the teeth, loaded every rifle, every pistol, every weapon they could find, called in the militia, set up patrols around the plantation, and then they started taking it out on us, the enslaved folks who hadn't done nothing, who didn't know nothing about the rebellion except what rumors said. They whipped old Samuel for looking insolent, whipped young Jacob for singing too loud, locked up 3 women in the root cellar just because they could, just to remind us who held the power. The air was thick with fear and rage and something else, possibility. The terrible, dangerous possibility that maybe, just maybe, the chains could be broken. Alice watched it all from the kitchen. watched white folks running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Watched them jump at every shadow, flinch at every sound. For the first time in her life, she saw them scared, really scared. And it filled her with a feeling she couldn't name, something between satisfaction and hunger. "They afraid," Dinah whispered, standing beside Alice at the kitchen window. "Look at them, they actually afraid of us." "And they should be," Alice said quietly. "They should have been afraid all along." The rebellion lasted 48 hours before the militia put it down. Killed most of Nat Turner's followers in brutal fighting, captured others and executed them in public, hanging their bodies from trees as warnings. Nat Turner himself escaped and hid for 2 months before they finally caught him. They hanged him in November, and even then, they say he went to the gallows with his head high, unrepentant, still believing he'd done the Lord's work. But the aftermath, sweet Jesus, the aftermath was worse than the rebellion itself. White folks across Virginia went crazy with revenge. They killed more than 200 black people, most of them innocent, had nothing to do with the uprising. Just killed them for being black, for being enslaved, for being there. Heads got cut off and stuck on poles. Bodies got burned. Children got sold away from their mothers as punishment. New laws got passed making it illegal for enslaved folks to gather, to preach, to learn to read, to do anything that might lead to another rebellion. Turner's Place became a fortress. Extra overseers got hired. New rules got made. No more than 5 black folks could gather at once. No more singing except approved hymns. No more moving around after dark. It was like they'd put chains on our chains, locked down what was already locked. But something else happened too. Something the white folks didn't see because they were too busy congratulating themselves on putting down the rebellion. A seed had been planted. A crack had appeared in the wall of their power. Because for 48 hours, enslaved people had fought back, had killed their masters, had tasted what freedom might feel like, even if that taste came soaked in blood. And Alice had paid attention, had watched how Nat Turner planned it, how he'd used the element of surprise, how he'd struck at night when folks were sleeping, when their guard was down, how he'd started small and grown the attack as he went. Different method, she thought, different weapon, but the same goal, Judgment Day for the oppressors. "If Nat Turner can do it with an axe," Alice whispered to herself one night, alone in her cabin, "I can do it with a cooking pot." She pulled out the pouches she'd been hiding for years, looked at the dried seeds, the ground roots, the powders she'd been preparing. Her mama's knowledge, her grandma's gift. 3 generations of survival skills passed down, waiting for this moment. Nat Turner gave them death fast, Alice said to the darkness, to the ancestors listening in the shadows. "I'm gonna give it to them slow, gonna feed them their judgment 1 spoonful at a time. And when they fall, they gonna know. They gonna die knowing that a black woman's hand sent them to hell." Outside, she heard the overseer's patrol go by, dogs barking, men calling to each other in the darkness. Inside, Alice sat in the dark and planned. The fear that Nat Turner had put into white folks, Alice was gonna use that. They were already on edge, already seeing threats everywhere. When the harvest feast came, and it would come, because white folks needed to prove they were still in control, they'd all gather in one place, all the overseers, all the drivers, all the men who'd participated in the cruelty of Turner's Place. And Alice would serve them a meal they'd never forget, would cook up judgment so complete that Nat Turner's rebellion would look like a small skirmish compared to the war she was about to wage from her kitchen. "You showed me the way, Brother Nat," Alice whispered into the night. "Showed me that resistance is possible, that we ain't got to just accept this forever. Now I'm gonna show them something else, that revenge don't have to come loud and obvious. Sometimes it comes quiet as a Sunday supper. Sometimes it comes smiling, with a serving spoon in its hand." From that night on, Alice wasn't just surviving anymore, she was preparing for war. And when the time came, when Massa Turner announced the harvest feast to prove everything was back to normal, Alice would be ready. The earth drank more blood that day than it had in years, but it was about to drink even more. And this time, it would be oppressor blood, not the blood of the oppressed. This time, judgment would come from the kitchen. In them days of deep sorrow, right after Nat Turner's rebellion got crushed and white folks was still jumpy as cats in a room full of rocking chairs, Massa Nathaniel Turner decided he needed to make a statement, needed to show all the other plantation owners in Southampton County that he was still in control, that his Negroes was still obedient, that everything at Turner's place was running smooth as Sunday morning. So he announced the harvest feast. It was a cool October morning when he called all the enslaved folks to gather in the yard. Must have been 200 of us standing there in the red clay, sun barely up, everybody tired from being roused early and wondering what fresh hell was about to rain down on our heads. The overseers stood around the edges with their whips and rifles, making sure nobody got ideas. Massa Turner stood on the porch of the big house, dressed in his finest coat, looking every inch the gentleman planter he pretended to be. Behind him, the white columns of that house rose up like tombstones, and Alice, standing in the back near the kitchen house, thought about how much blood had paid for that pretty architecture. "Listen up," Turner's voice carried across the yard. "I know recent events have caused some unrest, some fear, but I want to assure you all and our neighbors that Turner's place remains a model of proper order and Christian values." Christian values, Alice thought, her face blank as a wall. Like selling children, like rape, like working folks to death. Such Christian values. "Therefore," Turner continued, "I'm hosting a harvest feast on the first Saturday of November. I've invited all the overseers, drivers, and patrollers from the neighboring plantations, 40 men in total, to join us in celebrating another successful season." Alice's heart skipped. 40 men, all in one place, all eating from the same table. "Alice," Turner's voice cut through her thoughts, "step forward." Every eye turned to her as she moved through the crowd. Her legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else, but her face stayed calm. Years of practice had taught her how to hide everything that mattered. "Yes, Massa?" She kept her eyes down, posture bent, playing the role. "You're my best cook. I'm putting you in charge of the feast. I want turkey, ham, beef, all the fixings. Sweet potatoes, collard greens, cornbread, biscuits, pies, the works. I want a meal that'll make these men remember why Turner's place is the finest plantation in Virginia." "Yes, Massa." Alice's voice came out steady, but inside where the ancestors were watching, she was smiling. "I'll make them a meal they'll never forget. See that you do. You'll have help. Dinah, Bessie, and Mary will assist you. I want perfection, Alice. This feast represents our plantation's reputation." "I understand, Massa." "Perfection." He waved her away, already turning to discuss other business. Alice walked back through the crowd, and she could feel eyes on her, the other enslaved folks who knew what it meant to be singled out for special duty. Extra work, extra pressure, extra chances to get whipped if something went wrong. But Alice wasn't thinking about whips. She was thinking about 40 men. 40 mouths to feed. 40 lives that had built their prosperity on stolen bodies and broken families. 40 demons who were about to get exactly what they deserved. That night, after the work was done and the quarters had settled into that heavy quiet that comes before sleep, Alice sat on her pallet and pulled out a scrap of paper she'd stolen from the big house months ago. By the light of a tiny candle stub, she began to write. Not words, because writing was forbidden and dangerous, but symbols, little marks that only she understood. A map of her plan. Turkey. That's where the main dose would go. The dark meat especially, because it could hide the bitter taste better. Ham, a lighter dose in the glaze, sweet and deadly. Gravy, perfect for mixing in powders that dissolved easy. Pie filling, for those who made it through the main course, a final surprise in dessert. Punch, the rum punch that white men loved so much would carry death in liquid form. Alice studied her marks, her mind working through measurements and timing. Too much poison all at once and they'd taste it, spit it out, and she'd hang for nothing. Too little and some might survive, might tell what happened, might bring retribution down on the whole quarters. It had to be perfect. Just enough to kill slow enough that they'd all eat their fill, but fast enough that they'd die before they could ride for help. A delicate balance between patience and power. "You really gonna do it?" The voice came soft from the darkness. Dinah, lying on her own pallet across the cabin, had been awake and watching. Alice looked at the girl, 17 years old now, belly big with another overseer's forced child, eyes that had seen too much too young. "You didn't hear nothing," Alice said quietly. "I heard everything." Dinah sat up, moonlight from the window catching her face. "And I'm asking, you really gonna do it?" Long silence. The weight of what Alice was planning hung in the air between them like smoke. "They took my children," Alice finally said, her voice low and hard as iron. "Both of them. Isaiah sold to God knows where. Ruth taken to nurse white babies while her own mama's milk dried up unused. They took my body whenever they wanted. Took my labor, my youth, my hope. They took everything, Dinah. Everything except my knowledge and my will. They'll kill you for it. You know that. I'm already dead inside. Been dead since the day I watched Isaiah's hand reaching back for me from that wagon. This?" Alice gestured at her body. "This is just a ghost walking around. Might as well make the haunting count for something." Dinah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You gonna need help. Can't prepare a feast for 40 men by yourself, not the way you planning. I'm not asking anyone to—" "You ain't asking, I'm offering." Dinah's eyes were fierce now. "You think I forgot what Willis did to you? What Cyrus did to me? What all of them do to all of us every day and call it their right?" She touched her swollen belly. "This baby gonna be born into the same chains that bound us. Same whips, same pain. Maybe it's time somebody showed these white folk that we ain't just property that takes abuse quiet. If we do this, there ain't no going back." "Good." Dinah lay back down. "I'm tired of going forward into nothing but more suffering anyway. Let's go forward into judgment instead." Alice blew out the candle. Lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the quarters, snoring, crying, whispered prayers, the creak of old wood settling. Somewhere far off, an owl called, and Alice remembered her mama saying that owls were messengers between the living and the dead. "Are you watching, Mama?" Alice thought into the darkness. "Are you and Grandma Eve and Great-Grandma a days watching? Because your daughter is about to do something that'll either free us or damn us, and I need to know you're with me." The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards of the cabin. And in that wind, Alice swore she heard voices. Her mama, her grandma, all the ancestors who'd survived the unspeakable whispering, "We're here. We've always been here. And we'll be here when the time comes. Cook your meal, daughter. Serve your judgment. Make them remember that even the powerless got power when pushed far enough." Alice smiled in the darkness. 3 weeks until the feast. 21 days to prepare the most important meal she'd ever cook. 21 days until 40 men would sit down to supper and never stand up again. Massa want perfection? Alice thought. He gonna get it. Gonna get the most perfect revenge any cook ever served. Outside, the moon rose fat and bright. Another conjure moon, another night when the boundary between this world and the next grew thin. And in the kitchen house tomorrow, Alice would begin gathering her ingredients. Not just flour and salt and spices, but something else. Something her great-grandmother had carried across the ocean. Something her grandmother had cultivated in secret. Something her mother had taught her to use. The seeds of justice, the roots of retribution, the herbs of righteous judgment. The harvest feast was coming. And so was hell. Now listen here, child, because this is where science and spirit meet, where knowledge passed down through stolen generations becomes a weapon sharp as any sword. The old ones warned us. The earth gives us everything we need. Medicine to heal, food to nourish, and for those who know where to look, tools to fight back. Alice waited until 3 nights after Massa Turner made his announcement. Waited for a moonless night when darkness was thick as wool, and the patrollers were lazy after their evening whiskey. Then she slipped out of her cabin, quiet as death itself, and headed into the woods. She wasn't alone. Dinah followed, and old Bessie too. The elder had pulled Alice aside that afternoon and said simply, "I'm coming with you tonight. Don't argue." Behind them came Mary, another kitchen woman whose son had been sold south and never heard from again. 4 women moving through the darkness like spirits, like conjure women on a mission from the ancestors. They walked deep into the woods, following paths that only root doctors and conjure folk knew. Past the creek where Alice had washed Willis's violation from her skin. Past the slave cemetery, where generations of stolen people lay in unmarked graves. Deeper, deeper, until the sounds of the plantation faded and all they could hear was night birds calling and their own breathing, heavy with purpose. Alice stopped in a clearing where moonlight would have shone if there'd been a moon. The darkness here was absolute, suffering so thick you could taste it. But Alice knew this place, had been coming here since her mama first brought her as a child, teaching her which plants grew where, which roots held power, which seeds carried death. "We don't got much time," Alice whispered. "Patrollers make rounds every 2 hours. We got to gather what we need and get back before they notice we gone." "What we looking for exactly?" Mary asked, her voice nervous. Alice knelt and began digging with her bare hands, feeling in the darkness for what her fingers knew even when her eyes couldn't see. Several things. First, this. She pulled up a root, twisted and dark, still carrying dirt. "This is what my mama called devil's root. White folks call it something else, but that don't matter. What matters is that when you dry it and grind it fine, it stops the heart. Not right away. Takes about 30 minutes. Gives you time to get away before anybody knows what happened." She passed the root to Dinah, who tucked it carefully into the cloth sack she carried. "Next." Alice moved to a different spot, her hands searching through dead leaves and forest debris. "These here." She held up what looked like ordinary white flowers, bell-shaped and innocent. "My great-grandma brought the seeds for these from Africa. They pretty, ain't they? The mistress wanted to pick them once. I told her they was poisonous. She believed me because I looked simple and afraid. But the truth is worse than poisonous. These flowers, when you dry the petals and crush them into powder, they cause paralysis. Man eats this, he can't move, can't breathe right, but he can still feel everything. Still knows he's dying." "Good Lord," Bessie breathed. "That's cruel, child." "Is it?" Alice's voice was cold. "More cruel than selling babies? More cruel than rape? More cruel than working folks to death in fields that ain't even theirs?" She gathered flowers, stripping petals carefully. "Cruelty is what they taught us. I'm just a good student." They moved through the clearing, Alice pointing out plants that looked innocent but held power. Snake root that caused convulsions. Seeds from a vine that made you vomit until you died of dehydration. Mushrooms that looked like the edible kind, but destroyed your liver from the inside out. Bark from a tree that caused bleeding from every opening in the body. "How you know all this?" Mary asked, watching Alice work with practiced efficiency. "My mama taught me, her mama taught her, and her mama, my great-grandma Adaise, she learned it in Africa before they stole her. This knowledge been passed down through our family like treasure, like inheritance. Only thing they couldn't take from us." Alice stood, her bag heavy with deadly plants. "The white folks think we simple. Think we just know how to cook and clean and pick cotton. They don't know we carry whole libraries in our heads. Don't know that while we working in their kitchens, we learning which herbs heal and which ones kill." "That land carried heavy spirits," Bessie said suddenly, looking around the dark clearing. "Can't you feel them? All our ancestors watching, waiting to see what we do." Alice felt it. Felt the weight of all those eyes. Her mama, her grandma, her great-grandma, who'd survived the Middle Passage pregnant and afraid. Felt the eyes of every enslaved person who'd died at Turner's Place. Every mother who'd watched her children sold. Every woman who'd been violated. Every man who'd been worked to death. "They ain't just watching," Alice said quietly. "They helping. Right now, as we gather these plants, our ancestors are guiding our hands, are showing us what we need, are giving us the strength to do what they couldn't." She knelt one more time, digging for a particular root that grew only in the darkest part of the forest. Her fingers found it, thick and gnarled, pulsing with something that felt almost alive. "This is the last one, the most important." My mama called it the revenge root. Said it was sacred, said you only use it when all other options are gone. When justice is impossible and vengeance is all that's left. Alice pulled it from the earth, and for a moment she swore she heard singing. Faint and far away, like voices carried on wind from across an ocean, across centuries. The old language her great-grandma had spoken. Words of power, words of reckoning. "What's it do?" Dinah asked. "Everything." Alice held the root up dark against the darker sky. This one, when prepared right, carries all the effects of all the others. Stops the heart, paralyzes the lungs, causes bleeding, brings pain that makes a man beg for death. But more than that, my mama said it carries intention. Said that when you cook with this root, you cooking with purpose, with prayer, with the accumulated suffering of all your ancestors. Said that death from this root ain't just physical, it's spiritual. Sends the soul exactly where it deserves to go. She wrapped the root carefully in a scrap of cloth torn from her mama's old dress, the one Eve had been wearing when she died. This feast ain't just about killing 40 white men. It's about sending a message that echoes from here to eternity. It's about showing that some debts get paid, even if it takes generations. It's about justice that the courts won't give and mercy they don't deserve. "When do we prepare it?" Bessie asked. "Tomorrow night. In the kitchen house after everyone else is asleep. We'll dry the herbs, grind the roots, mix the powders. Takes time to do it right. Can't rush judgment." Alice started walking back toward the plantation. "And we got to be careful. One whiff of the wrong smell, one suspicious glance from an overseer, and we all end up at the whipping post or worse." They walked back in silence. 4 women carrying death in cloth bags, carrying hope in their hearts, carrying the weight of generations on their shoulders. The darkness hid them, embraced them, protected them like the ancestors themselves had wrapped shadows around their dangerous mission. When they reached the edge of the quarters, Alice stopped. "One more thing. Once we start preparing the poison, there ain't no turning back. Once we cook it into the feast, we all complicit. We all guilty in white folks' eyes. You sure you ready for this?" Dinah didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." "I been ready," Mary said. Bessie touched Alice's arm. "Child, I'm 67 years old. Been enslaved since I was 5. Lost 3 husbands to sale, 7 children to various horrors, and more grandchildren than I can count. I'm ready to see some justice before I die, even if the justice is dark as midnight and soaked in blood. Even if seeing it means I don't see tomorrow." Alice nodded, felt tears trying to come but pushed them back down. No time for tears. Tears were for after, if there was an after. Right now there was only the work. "Then let's go cook up some judgment," Alice said. "Let's make a meal the devil himself would be afraid to eat." They slipped back into the quarters, each to her own cabin, carrying their deadly harvest. And if the spirits were watching, and Alice believed they were, they saw 4 women who'd finally had enough. 4 women who were about to transform suffering into power, oppression into uprising, and a kitchen into a battlefield. The night carried heavy spirits, and those spirits were singing songs of vengeance in keys that only the broken could hear. Listen here, child, because what happened in that kitchen house during the week before the feast wasn't just cooking. It was ritual. It was prayer. It was 4 black women turning suffering into sacrament, transforming oppression into communion, making that kitchen into a temple where judgment was the only God being worshipped. Every night after the white folks went to bed, after the overseers stumbled drunk to their cabins, after the quarters grew quiet with exhausted sleep, that's when Alice, Dinah, Bessie, and Mary would slip into the kitchen house. They'd light just one small candle, barely enough to see by, and begin the sacred work. The first night, they laid everything out on the big wooden table. All the roots and herbs and flowers they'd gathered, spread like offerings on an altar. Alice stood at the head of the table, and without planning it, the moment felt like church, the kind of church they had in the hush harbors, where the spirit moved real and raw, where God listened to prayers that couldn't be spoken in white folks' hearing. "Before we start," Alice said, her voice low and serious, "we need to pray. Need to ask the ancestors to guide our hands. Need to make sure what we doing is righteous, not just revenge. Ain't they the same? Dinah asked. No. Alice shook her head. Revenge is about making yourself feel better. Righteousness is about making things right, even when right looks like death. Bessie stepped forward, her old hands scarred from decades of labor reaching toward the pile of deadly plants. Let me speak the prayer. I'm the oldest. Carried this burden longest. Know the words that need saying. The three younger women bowed their heads. Bessie's voice rose up, mixing English with fragments of languages that came from before the ships, before the chains, before the names got stolen. Ancestors who crossed the water in chains, hear us. Mama Eve, who survived the Middle Passage pregnant and afraid, hear us. Great-Grandma Adais, who carried these sacred seeds from Africa, hear us. All you who died in these fields, who were sold away from your babies, who were whipped and violated and worked to death, hear us now. Her voice cracked but didn't break. We about to do something terrible. About to take 40 lives. We know that blood calls for blood, that maybe we gonna pay for this with our own deaths. But we also know that enough is enough, that some evils are so great that mercy becomes sin, that justice delayed is justice denied, and we've been denied too long. Akse, Alice whispered, the Yoruba word for so be it that her mama had taught her. Akse, the others echoed, guide our hands, make the poison strong but not detectable. Let these men eat their fill before they realize what we done, and when they die, Bessie's voice turned hard as iron. When they die, may they know. May they understand in their last moments that this is payment. That black women's hands can give death as easy as they give food. That we ain't been sleeping, we been waiting. Akse, amen. And so it is. Alice opened her eyes. Now let's get to work. They started with the drying. Spread the roots and flowers on clean cloth, hanging some from the rafters, laying others near the banked fire where slow heat would pull the moisture out without destroying the potency. The kitchen filled with strange smells, bitter, sweet, acrid, floral, all mixing together into something that made your nose burn and your eyes water. We tell anybody who asks that we testing new spices, Alice said, grinding roots in the big mortar with the pestle. The rhythm was steady, hypnotic, like drums calling the spirits. Say Massa wants something special for the feast. Dinah was crushing flower petals, her young hands working with surprising skill. How much we need? Enough for 40 men, plus extras in case some eat more than others. Alice measured by eye and instinct, the way her mama had taught her. A pinch of this, a handful of that. Portions measured by intention as much as quantity. Each powder does something different. We gonna mix them all together, but carefully. Can't have them reacting wrong and losing strength. Mary was at the other end of the table, scraping bark into fine shavings. What if someone gets suspicious? What if they smell it in the food? That's where the art comes in. Alice smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who'd planned every detail, who'd thought of every problem, who'd spent years preparing for this moment. We gonna use strong flavors to mask it. Lots of sage in the turkey dressing, heavy molasses in the ham glaze, strong coffee in the gravy. The punch gonna have so much rum and spice that they won't taste nothing but celebration. 3 nights they worked like this, grinding and mixing, testing small amounts on their own tongues just to see how bitter it was, how much sweetness would be needed to hide the taste. Alice would take a tiny taste, not enough to harm, just enough to know, and her face would twist. Bitter as gall, she'd say, then add more honey to the test batch, more sugar, more molasses. Got to be sweet enough that greed overrides caution. But on the 4th night, something almost went wrong. They were deep into the preparation, all 4 women focused on their tasks when they heard footsteps outside. Heavy footsteps, boot steps. An overseer was walking past the kitchen house, probably heading to the privy or checking on something, and he stopped. Just stood there outside the door. The 4 women froze. Dinah's eyes went wide with terror. Mary's hands started shaking. Even Bessie looked afraid, and Bessie didn't scare easy. Alice moved quick and quiet as a cat, grabbed a pot, dumped some regular spices in it, and started stirring loud enough to be heard. "Dinah," she said in a normal voice, "hand me that sage. Want to make sure the stuffing seasoning is right?" The door opened. Willis stood there, lamp in hand, eyes suspicious. "What y'all doing in here this late?" Alice didn't flinch, didn't show fear, even though her heart was pounding loud as drums. "Massa Turner want this feast to be perfect, sir. We testing the seasonings, making sure everything gonna taste right. Can't do that during the day when we got regular cooking to do." Willis stepped inside, his eyes scanning the kitchen. The deadly powders were right there on the table in plain sight. But Alice had been smart, had mixed them into regular spice jars, had labeled them with marks that looked like inventory counts. To Willis's ignorant eyes, it just looked like a kitchen getting ready for a big meal. "Smells strange," he said, nose wrinkling. "Yes, sir. That's the new spices from Richmond. Massa bought them special. Exotic seasonings for an exotic feast." Alice kept her voice level, kept her body language submissive. "You want to taste the stuffing mixture? Make sure it's good enough?" She held out a spoonful, completely safe, no poison in this test batch, and waited to see if he'd take it. This was the moment. If he tasted it and liked it, he'd leave. If he got suspicious, if he decided to investigate further, they'd all be at the whipping post by morning. Willis looked at the spoon, looked at Alice's carefully blank face, looked at the other women pretending to work. Then he grunted, "I ain't no cook. Y'all just make sure it's good. Massa's counting on this feast going perfect." "Yes, sir. We gonna make sure everybody gets exactly what they deserve." He left, pulling the door shut behind him. The moment his footsteps faded, all 4 women let out breaths they'd been holding. "Sweet Jesus," Mary whispered. "I thought we were done for." "That was too close," Dinah said, trembling. But Alice was smiling, really smiling for the first time since they'd started this work. "No, that was perfect." Willis came, looked around, and saw nothing suspicious. When the men start dying at the feast, he gonna remember this night and think, "I checked the kitchen, everything was normal." Gonna make it harder for them to figure out what happened. Bessie laughed, a sound like dry leaves rattling. "Child, you got a mind sharp as any blade. You've been planning this long, ain't you?" "All my life," Alice said quietly. "Since the day they sold Isaiah. Since the night Willis took what wasn't his to take. Since every moment I stood in this kitchen and fed the people who treated us like animals. Yeah, I've been planning. And in 3 days, every bit of planning gonna come together." They worked until just before dawn, until the last powder was ground, the last mixture was prepared, the last deadly ingredient was ready to be cooked into the feast. Alice stored everything in unmarked jars, hid them in the back of the spice cupboard where no one looked, where only she knew what was what. "Saturday morning, we start cooking for real," Alice told the others as they prepared to slip back to the quarters. "We cook like we never cooked before. We make this meal so good, so delicious, so perfect, that those 40 men won't be able to resist, won't be able to stop eating even when their bellies are full. 'Cause gluttony is a sin, and we gonna use their sin against them." "One more thing," Bessie said at the door. "When this is over, when we've done what we set out to do, what happens to us?" Alice looked at each woman in turn. Dinah, young and pregnant and tired of being violated. Mary, middle-aged and empty after losing everyone she loved. Bessie, old and scarred and ready to see some justice before she died. And herself, Alice the cook, daughter of Eve, granddaughter of a daisy, carrier of knowledge and pain and righteous fury. "Probably they'll kill us," Alice said simply. "Probably hang us, or worse. But we'll die knowing we struck back, die knowing we made them pay, die knowing that our name's gonna live forever in the quarters, in the stories, in the memory of our people. They can kill our bodies, but they can't kill what we're about to do. That gonna echo from here to eternity." "Then let it echo loud," Dinah said fiercely. "Let it echo so loud that every enslaved person from here to hell hears it and knows. We fought back." They clasped hands in the darkness, 4 women about to become legends. 4 women about to transform a kitchen into a killing ground. 4 women who'd finally had enough. The feast was in 3 days, and with it, judgment. Great God Almighty! The morning of the feast dawned cold and clear. The kind of November day that makes you think maybe mercy might exist somewhere in the world, even though you know better. Alice woke before sunrise, like she'd been doing all her life. But this morning was different. This morning, she was waking up to wage war. She dressed carefully, tied her head wrapped tight, and walked across the yard to the kitchen house, while stars were still visible in the sky. The big house stood silent and white in the pre-dawn darkness, and Alice looked at it and thought, by tonight that house gonna be full of screaming. By tonight all your pride gonna turn to horror. By tonight you gonna learn what happens when you push people past the point of enduring. Inside the kitchen, Dinah and Mary were already there, having come even earlier. Bessie arrived moments later, moving stiff because her old bones didn't like the cold, but her eyes were bright and fierce. "Let's cook these devils their last supper," Bessie said. They started with the turkeys, 3 big ones that had been fattening all fall. Alice supervised the butchering, the cleaning, the preparation. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was somewhere else, watching the clock, calculating timing, making sure everything would be ready at exactly the right moment. "The stuffing," Alice said. "That's where most of the poison goes. Inside the bird where it'll soak into the meat as it cooks. By the time that turkey is done, every bite gonna carry death." Dinah mixed the cornbread, the sage, the onions, and then Alice added the special ingredient, the powder they'd spent all week preparing, ground so fine it looked like black pepper, bitter as betrayal and twice as deadly. She measured carefully, divided it between the 3 birds, worked it into the stuffing with her bare hands. "How much time they got after eating?" Mary asked, watching. "Depends on how much they eat, how fast it gets to their blood. Somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour." Alice wiped her hands. "Long enough that they'll all have eaten. Short enough that they won't make it far when they try to run." The hams went in next. 2 huge ones, glazed with molasses, brown sugar, and ground cloves that hid the bitter powder mixed in. The sweet potatoes got mashed with butter and cinnamon, and something else that made Dinah's eyes water when she leaned too close. The collard greens simmered in pot liquor that Alice had seasoned special. Even the cornbread and biscuits got a light dusting of powder worked into the flour. "Everything?" Mary asked, incredulous. "Even the bread?" "Everything," Alice confirmed. "Because some men eat light, some eat heavy. Some prefer meat, some prefer vegetables. I want to make sure every man who sits at that table gets his portion of judgment, no matter what he puts on his plate." The pies came last. Sweet potato, pecan, apple. Each one a work of art, each one carrying death in its filling. Alice worked the crusts by hand, crimped the edges perfect, brushed them with egg wash until they shined golden. These pies looked like love, looked like care, looked like everything a good cook would make for honored guests. They were tombstones in pastry form. By noon, the kitchen was an inferno. 3 fires burning hot, pots bubbling, ovens roaring, steam rising up thick enough to choke on. The 4 women worked without stopping, sweat pouring down their faces, hands moving constant, creating a feast that would be talked about for generations. And the smell, Lord have mercy. The smell was enough to make you weep with hunger. Roasting turkey, baking ham, sweet molasses, warm spices, fresh bread. It smelled like Thanksgiving, like Christmas, like celebration. It smelled like everything good and homey and safe. It smelled like victory disguised as a meal. The white men started arriving around 3 o'clock, 40 of them, like Massa Turner promised, overseers and drivers and patrollers from every plantation in Southampton County. They came on horseback, came in wagons, came walking up the road, laughing and joking, rifles on their shoulders, whips on their belts, confidence in every step. Alice watched them through the kitchen window, recognized most of them by sight or reputation. There was Cyrus, the driver who'd beaten old Samuel to death last winter. There was Patterson, who'd sold his own mixed-race children down to Louisiana. There was Williams, who liked to make enslaved women fight each other for his entertainment. There was Jenkins, who'd shot a man for looking at him wrong. 40 demons, 40 architects of suffering, 40 men who'd built their lives on stolen labor and broken families, and every single one of them was about to die. "Alice," Massa Turner called from the big house. "How's the food coming?" "Almost ready, Massa," she called back. "Just putting final touches on everything." "Good, our guests are eager to eat." "I bet they are," Alice thought. "I bet they can smell it from here, can smell their own deaths cooking and don't even know it." At 4 o'clock, they started bringing the food out. Alice carried the first turkey herself, placed it at the head of the table on the porch of the big house. The long table, 40 seats, covered in white cloth, set with the mistress's good china, looked like something from a painting, looked civilized, looked proper, looked like a trap, and every man was walking right into it. Dinah brought the hams, Mary carried the bowls of vegetables, Bessie followed with the bread baskets. Back and forth they walked, bringing dish after dish, building a feast that made the white men's eyes go wide with greed and anticipation. "Turner, you outdone yourself," one of the overseers called out. "This looks fit for royalty." "Only the best for the finest men in Virginia," Massa Turner replied, beaming with pride. Alice stood to the side, hands folded, face blank, watching them sit down, watching them tie napkins around their necks like bibs, watching them rub their hands together in anticipation, watching them pour whiskey from bottles, punch from the bowl Alice had prepared special. "Shall we say grace?" someone suggested. "Indeed." Massa Turner bowed his head. "Lord, we thank thee for this bountiful feast, for the prosperity of our plantations, for the order thou hast established in thy wisdom." "Order," Alice thought bitterly. "You mean chains. You mean whips. You mean selling babies. And we ask thy blessing on this meal and all who partake of it. Amen." "Amen," 40 voices chorused. And then they began to eat. Alice watched the first forks go into the turkey, watched the first bites enter their mouths, watched their faces light up with pleasure as they tasted the stuffing, the gravy, the perfectly seasoned meat. "This is delicious," one man exclaimed. "Best damn turkey I ever had," another agreed. They ate like starving men, piling their plates high, going back for seconds before they'd finished firsts. Ate the ham, the greens, the sweet potatoes, drank the punch by the cupful, laughed and told stories and congratulated themselves on being such fine, upstanding citizens. 30 minutes passed. 40. Alice kept count, watching the clock inside her head, waiting for the first sign. It came at 43 minutes after they'd started eating. One of the overseers, a fat man named Robertson, suddenly went pale, grabbed his throat, tried to stand but his legs wouldn't work right. "You all right, Robertson?" someone asked. I feel..." Robertson's words slurred. He gripped the table edge, knuckles white. "Something's wrong." Then another man clutched his chest. Then another grabbed his stomach. Within 5 minutes, all 40 of them were showing symptoms, faces going gray, hands trembling, eyes going wide with the first terrible understanding that something was very, very wrong. "What's happening?" Massa Turner gasped. "What?" He couldn't finish. His throat was closing up, his heart was racing wrong, his blood was carrying death through every vein. Chaos erupted. Men falling out of their chairs, men vomiting onto the white tablecloth, men crawling toward the stairs, trying to get to their horses, trying to get to help. But their bodies wouldn't obey. The poison had done its work too well. Alice stood there and watched with a face as calm as Sunday morning, watched 40 men who dealt death their whole lives finally receiving their portion, watched them suffer the way they'd made others suffer, only quicker, which was more mercy than they'd ever shown. Willis was the first to figure it out. He looked at Alice with his dying eyes and whispered through blood-foamed lips, You did this." Alice stepped forward then, looked down at the man who'd violated her, who'd stolen her dignity, who'd thought she was too powerless to fight back. "Yes," she said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I cooked your judgment and served it with a smile. And I hope you taste it all the way down to hell." His eyes went wide. Shock, horror, and something else. Maybe respect, maybe fear. Maybe the first real understanding that the woman he'd thought was nothing had been everything he should have feared. Then he died. They all did, one by one, in various stages of agony and terror, until the feast table looked like a battlefield, until the white cloth was stained with blood and vomit, and the last gasps of 40 men who'd finally met justice disguised as hospitality. Alice looked at the carnage, looked at her hands that had cooked it, and felt nothing, no joy, no satisfaction, just emptiness where her heart used to be. "It's done," she said to the other women. "Judgment has been served." In them days of deep sorrow, they say that after a great storm passes, there comes a silence so complete it feels like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting to see what rises from the wreckage. That's what the moments after the feast felt like. Silence so heavy it had weight, so thick you could taste it like copper on your tongue. Alice stood at the edge of the porch, looking at the carnage she'd created. 40 bodies sprawled across chairs, slumped over the table, collapsed on the ground. Some had died quick, faces frozen in surprise. Others had suffered longer, bodies twisted in final agony. The white tablecloth that had looked so pristine hours ago was now stained with blood, vomit, spilled food. A testament written in the language of justice finally delivered. The other enslaved folks began emerging from the quarters, drawn by the unnatural quiet, by the absence of the overseer's usual shouting and violence. They came slow, hesitant, not understanding yet what they were seeing. Old Moses was first, leaning on his walking stick, squinting at the scene. Behind him came the field hands, the house servants, the children clutching their mothers' skirts. "Sweet Jesus," Moses breathed when he got close enough to understand. "What happened here?" "Judgment," Alice said simply. Her voice was calm, flat, like she was reporting the weather. "They ate. They died. It's finished." "Alice." Moses looked at her with something between horror and awe. "What did you do? What needed doing?" She finally moved, finally broke her statue stillness, walked to the well, drew up a bucket of cold water, and began washing her hands, scrubbed them clean of flour and spices and the invisible residue of 40 deaths. The water ran clear because there was no blood on her hands, not literally anyway. The blood was all internal, all spiritual, all carried in places soap couldn't reach. Dinah, Mary, and Bessie stood together near the kitchen house, watching the growing crowd of enslaved people surround the death feast. Nobody spoke. Nobody cried out. They just looked, trying to process what their eyes were telling them, that the men who'd held the whips, who'd dealt the violence, who'd seemed invincible, were now just corpses cooling in the November air. "Is Massa Turner?" someone asked, not finishing the question. "Dead," Alice confirmed. "All of them, every overseer, every driver, every patroller who came to celebrate their power over us. All dead. How?" Alice dried her hands on her apron, the same apron she'd worn while cooking death, the same apron that had hidden pouches of poison, the same apron that would probably hang in a museum someday, or burn with her body, depending on how history decided to remember this moment. "The food. I seasoned their feast with something more permanent than sage." The crowd rippled with whispers. Some folks backed away from Alice like she'd become something dangerous, something other than human. Others pressed closer, eyes shining with emotions they'd never been allowed to express: satisfaction, vindication, fierce joy at seeing their oppressors finally brought low. "They gonna kill you for this," Moses said quietly. "When word gets out, they gonna come with ropes and torches and make an example so terrible that—" "I know," Alice cut him off. "Known it from the start. This wasn't about survival. This was about making them pay. About showing that we ain't helpless, that even a cook in a kitchen can wage war." She looked around at the faces of her people, scared, hopeful, confused, inspired. "They gonna kill me. Probably kill Dinah, Mary, and Bessie too. But before I die, I need y'all to understand something." She raised her voice so everyone could hear. I didn't do this for revenge. Well, maybe partly for revenge. But mostly, I did it so every enslaved person in Virginia would know. We can fight back. Maybe not with guns or swords. Maybe not in ways that white folks expect. But we can fight. We got knowledge they don't respect. We got patience they can't imagine. We got rage they think we're too simple to feel. And when we decide to use it, ain't nothing they can do to stop us. But the cost, someone started. The cost is always high, Bessie interrupted, her old voice cracking but strong. The cost of slavery is children sold, is women violated, is men worked to death, is dignity stolen, is humanity denied. Alice just made 40 men pay a portion of what they owed. Just a portion, mind you. The full debt could never be paid. A young woman, couldn't have been more than 19, stepped forward. Her name was Sarah, and Alice knew her story. Sold away from her family in North Carolina, made to breed like livestock, beaten when she cried. What do we do now? Sarah asked. Good question. What do you do in the moment after revolution? After the first blow is struck? After the oppressor falls but before the consequences arrive? Now, Alice said, thinking fast. Some of you need to run, especially the young ones, the strong ones who got a chance of making it north. Take the horses from the stable. Take what food you can carry. Head for the Underground Railroad. There's a station in Petersburg. Ask for the Quaker family on Oak Street. Tell them Alice the cook sent you. Tell them what happened here. They'll help you. And the rest of us? Moses asked. The rest of us wait. Wait for the militia to come. Wait for the trials that ain't really trials. Wait for whatever punishment white folks decide is sufficient for the crime of refusing to die quiet. Alice's voice gentled. But while we wait, we remember. We tell this story to each other, over and over, so it gets carved into memory so deep that time can't erase it. We make sure that long after I'm gone, folks still know. Alice the cook fed justice to 40 demons, and they choked on it. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The feast table sat in shadow, a monument to what happens when patience runs out, when suffering becomes unbearable, when the powerless decide to seize power the only way they can. Alice walked to her cabin one last time, gathered a few things, her mama's old head wrap, the scrap of cloth her grandma Eve had carried from Africa, a small wooden cross someone had carved for her years ago. She changed into her best dress, the one she'd been saving for she didn't know what. Seemed appropriate to meet death in your finest clothes, with your dignity intact, with your head held high. When she came back out, Dinah was waiting. The young woman looked scared but resolute, hand resting on her pregnant belly. We did it, Dinah said simply. We did. Alice took her hand. Your baby gonna be born into the same chains we wore, but at least they'll grow up hearing this story, hearing that their mama was brave, that their mama fought back. That matters, Dinah. That matters more than survival. They walked together back to the yard where the enslaved community had gathered. Some folks were already fleeing. Alice could see shapes disappearing into the woods, hear horses galloping away into the darkness. Good. Let some of them escape. Let some of them carry the story north, carry it until it became legend. The rest stood witness. Stood in a circle around Alice, Dinah, Mary, and Bessie. The 4 women who'd transformed a kitchen into a battlefield, who'd used the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, who'd served death with the same hands that had served life for so many years. They'll be here by morning, Moses predicted. The militia, maybe a mob. Let them come, Alice said. She felt strangely peaceful, like a burden she'd carried for 22 years had finally been set down. I'm ready. Been ready. My children, Isaiah and Ruth, wherever they are tonight, I hope they feel it. Hope they know their mama didn't die crying, died fighting. Old Bessie began to hum. Just a low sound at first, wordless, ancient. Then others joined in, and it became a song. One of the old spirituals from the hush harbors, from the hidden churches. from the places where enslaved people worshipped God in their own way, in their own words, without white supervision. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Alice closed her eyes and let the song wash over her. Let it carry her back to her mama's voice, her grandma's stories, her great-grandma's crossing of the terrible water. Let it remind her that she was part of something larger than herself, larger than this moment, larger than even death. When she opened her eyes again, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The same stars her ancestors had used to navigate. The same stars that freedom seekers followed north. The same stars that would keep shining long after every person standing here tonight was dust. Remember, Alice said one last time. Remember and tell. That's all I ask. The night settled in, heavy with spirits. Somewhere far off, dogs were barking. The militia was coming. Alice sat down on the steps of her cabin and waited for judgment to arrive, knowing she'd already delivered her own. Folks swear on their lives that some pain is so great, it stops being pain and becomes something else. Becomes a test, a trial, a crucible where the soul either breaks or transforms into something the body can't contain anymore. What happened to Alice in that cellar after the militia came was that kind of pain. They arrived at dawn, 30 white men on horseback, armed with rifles and ropes and rage so hot you could feel it radiating like heat off stones. The overseer from the neighboring plantation, a man named Wexford who'd come late to the feast and thereby escaped the poisoning. He led them straight to Alice. She didn't run, didn't hide, just stood in front of her cabin wearing her mama's head wrap and her best dress, hands at her sides, waiting. "That's her," Wexford pointed with a shaking finger. "That's the one, Alice, she admitted it, said she poisoned the food." The militia captain, a young man with a thin mustache and cold eyes, dismounted slowly. "You, Alice?" "Yes, sir." Her voice was steady. "You kill those 40 men?" "Yes, sir." No hesitation, no denial. What would be the point? His hand moved so fast she barely saw it coming, a backhand across her face that split her lip and sent her stumbling. She tasted blood, copper and warm, but didn't cry out. Wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "Where are the others?" he demanded. "Who helped you?" "I worked alone." The lie came smooth as butter. Dinah, Mary, and Bessie had already fled with some of the others who'd run north. Whether they'd make it, Alice didn't know. But she could at least give them time, give them a chance. Just me. Just my hands. Just my knowledge. "Liar!" Wexford stepped forward. "I saw multiple women cooking. I saw—" "You saw women following my orders," Alice interrupted. "They didn't know what I was putting in the food. They just did as they were told, same as always. You want someone to punish? I'm right here." The captain studied her with those cold eyes. Then he nodded to his men. "Take her to the cellar. We'll get the truth out of her." They dragged her, not to a proper jail, there wasn't time for that, but to the plantation's root cellar, a dark hole in the ground where vegetables were stored for winter. Cold, damp, smelling of earth and rot. They chained her wrists to an iron ring set in the wall, chained them high so she had to stand on her toes or hang by her arms. Then the questioning began. It wasn't questioning. It was torture dressed up with questions attached, as if the pain was meant to produce truth instead of whatever words would make the pain stop. They beat her with sticks, with fists, with the flat of a shovel. Asked between each blow, "Who helped you? Where'd you get the poison? Who else was involved?" And each time Alice gave the same answer or no answer, just hung there and took it, feeling ribs crack, feeling her face swell, feeling her body become a catalog of injuries that someday someone might read and understand the cost of resistance. On the second day, or maybe it was the third, time moved strange in that darkness. They brought fire. Held hot metal close to her skin, close enough that she could smell her own flesh cooking, close enough that screaming became involuntary. Not a choice, but something the body did independent of will. "The others!" the captain shouted. "Give us their names and this stops." Alice bit her tongue until it bled. Wouldn't speak. Couldn't speak. had nothing left to say except the truth they didn't want to hear. That one woman with knowledge was enough. That rage didn't need accomplices when it had been fed for 22 years. That they'd made her into this and now wanted to blame her for becoming exactly what they'd created. On what might have been the fourth day, they tried water, held her down, she was too weak to fight by then, and poured water over a cloth covering her face. Drowning without water, suffocating without death, the terrible illusion that each breath would be her last. They asked their questions between sessions, but Alice had gone somewhere else by then, had retreated into a place where her mama lived, where her grandma told stories, where her great-grandma sang in languages the white folks would never understand. "She won't break," someone said. Sounded frustrated, scared even. "Everyone breaks," the captain replied, but he sounded less certain. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand because they'd never had to, was that Alice had been broken so many times already that there was nothing left to break. They'd broken her when they sold Isaiah, broken her when they took Ruth, broken her when Willis violated her, broken her every day of her life in small ways and large. This was just more of the same, just louder, just with official sanction. On the fifth day, a preacher came. White man with a Bible and kind eyes that didn't match the institution he represented. He sat across from where Alice hung in her chains, body ruined but spirit somehow still intact. "Daughter," he said softly, "confess your sins, and God may yet grant you mercy." Alice laughed. Actually laughed, though it came out wet and painful through her broken mouth. "Mercy? Where was mercy when they sold my babies? Where was mercy every day of my life? Those men had families, children, wives who are now widows. And how many families they destroyed." Alice's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried. "How many children they sold. How many wives they violated. You want to talk about families, preacher? Talk about mine. Talk about every black family they tore apart for profit." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and left without another word. That night, they decided to move her. The questioning had failed. The torture had produced nothing useful. Alice was dying slowly in that cellar, and they needed her alive long enough for a public execution, a public lesson about what happens to enslaved people who forget their place. They carried her out because she couldn't walk, laid her in a wagon on a bed of straw like she was a wounded animal. The night air felt shockingly cold after the cellar's damp darkness. Alice looked up at the stars, the same stars she'd looked at after the feast, and felt something like peace settle over her. She'd done it, had struck back, had made them pay. And even if they killed her tomorrow, even if they made her death as terrible as they could imagine, she'd still won. Because fear was power, and she'd put fear into white folks' hearts. Fear that their cooks might poison them. Fear that their servants might be planning revenge. Fear that maybe, just maybe, black folks weren't as content with slavery as white folks wanted to believe. The wagon rolled through the darkness toward wherever they were taking her. Alice closed her eyes and let herself drift, let herself remember Isaiah's face the last time she saw him. Ruth's baby hands reaching for her. Her mama's voice singing, her grandma's stories, her great-grandma's strength that had crossed an ocean and survived the unsurvivable. "I'm coming," Alice whispered to them across whatever distance separated the living from the dead. "I'm coming, and I'm coming proud. I'm coming having fought back. I'm coming having shown them that we're human, we're powerful, and we won't endure forever." Somewhere in the darkness, she heard singing. The old songs from the quarters, from the hush harbors, from the places where enslaved people made their own meaning out of stolen lives. She didn't know if it was real, or if she was dreaming, or if the line between the two had finally dissolved. But she sang along anyway, voice broken but unbowed, body destroyed but spirit intact, preparing to meet whatever came next with the same courage she'd showed cooking that feast of judgment. They could kill her body. They already had, really. But they couldn't kill what she'd done. Couldn't kill the story. Couldn't kill the knowledge that resistance was possible, that the powerless could become powerful. that even a cook in a kitchen could wage war. Alice smiled into the darkness and waited for dawn. Lord have mercy, there are some mornings that break different than others. The morning they came to hang Alice, the sun rose red as blood over Southampton County, and even the white folks who'd come to watch said later that the sky looked like judgment itself was watching. They brought her out of the wagon at the old hanging tree, massive oak that had stood for 200 years, thick branches spreading wide like arms ready to embrace death. How many had died there before? 10, 20, 100? The tree didn't keep count, just drank the blood that soaked into its roots and kept growing. Alice could barely stand. 5 days of torture had left her body broken in ways that wouldn't heal even if they gave her time, which they wouldn't. Her face was swollen, eyes nearly shut, ribs cracked and grinding with each shallow breath. But when the militiamen tried to carry her, she shook her head. "I'll walk," she said through split lips. "Let me walk to my own death." They looked at each other, these white men who'd spent days trying to break her, and something passed between them, maybe respect, maybe fear, maybe just confusion that a half-dead black woman could still have pride. They let her walk. Each step was agony, each breath was fire. But Alice put one foot in front of the other, moving slow but steady across the red Virginia clay toward the tree, toward the rope, toward whatever came after. The crowd that had gathered parted as she approached, some silent, some jeering, some just staring with the peculiar hunger people get when they come to witness death. The enslaved folks from Turner's Place and the surrounding plantations had been forced to come, made to watch as a lesson. They stood separate from the white crowd, faces carefully blank, but Alice could see it in their eyes. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that looked like hope, like pride, like the beginning of understanding that resistance was possible even if the cost was terrible. Alice found their faces in the crowd, found young Sarah, who she'd told to run north. The girl hadn't run, had stayed, and now stood watching with tears running silent down her face. Found old Moses leaning on his stick, lips moving in prayer. Found a dozen others whose names she knew, whose stories she carried, whose suffering she'd witnessed year after year. She nodded to them. Just a small movement of her broken head, but it said everything. "I did this for you. I did this for us. Remember." The platform stood beneath the hanging tree, rough wooden planks, a crate to stand on, the noose already tied and waiting. The militia captain read from a paper, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Alice, property of the late Nathaniel Turner, you have been found guilty of murder in the death of 40 white men. You have confessed to poisoning the harvest feast with deliberate intent to kill. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. You want to add anything?" someone asked. "Any last words before?" "Yes." Alice's voice came out stronger than it had any right to, powered by something beyond the broken body it came from. "I got last words." The crowd went quiet. Even the jeering stopped. Everybody wanted to hear what the poisoner would say, what defense or plea or curse would come from her mouth. Alice looked up at the sky, that blood-red sky, and began to speak. Not to the white folks, to her people, to the enslaved community forced to witness this moment. "The Lord is my shepherd," she started, and recognition rippled through the black section of the crowd. Psalm 23, the psalm of death and deliverance, the psalm they sang at funerals, at burials, at every goodbye that came too soon. "I shall not want." Her voice grew stronger with each line, like the words themselves were medicine. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The white folks looked confused, wondering why she was reciting Bible verses, wondering if this was repentance or something else. "He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." But the enslaved folks understood that Alice wasn't just reciting, she was testifying, was turning her execution into a sermon, her death into a message. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." They put the noose around her neck then, rough rope scratching against skin already raw from chains. Alice didn't stop speaking. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. They positioned her on the crate, the rope pulling tight, forcing her to stand on her toes. Still, she continued, Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. The militia captain made a signal. Someone put a hand on the crate, ready to kick it away. Alice kept going, voice rising, filling the morning air with words that had sustained her people through centuries of suffering. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. A table, she said, and everybody there knew she was talking about the feast, about the table she'd prepared, about the 40 men who'd sat down as enemies and never stood up again. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. The crate moved under her feet, unstable, ready to fall or be kicked. Alice looked straight ahead, not at the rope or the crowd, but at something beyond, something only she could see. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. The crate kicked away. Alice dropped. The rope snapped tight. Her neck should have broken, should have killed her instant, which was as close to mercy as a hanging ever got. But something went wrong, or right depending on how you looked at it. The rope caught wrong, strangled instead of snapped, and Alice hung there suffocating, body swinging, legs kicking at empty air. And still she kept speaking. Even with the rope crushing her throat, even with her neck compressed and her air cut off, Alice's voice came out, strangled and rasping but clear enough to hear, clear enough to understand, impossible and terrible and miraculous all at once. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The crowd went dead silent. White folks stared in horror. Black folks stared in awe. Nobody could explain it. Nobody could understand it. But everybody heard it. Alice the cook finishing her psalm even after the hanging should have silenced her. The words echoed across the gathering, across the red clay, across the plantation, carrying on the wind like the voice of every enslaved person who'd ever died silent. Every mother who'd never got to say goodbye. Every soul stolen and lost and forgotten. Then, finally, mercifully, Alice's body went still. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something, fear or wonder, or the terrible understanding that they'd just witnessed something beyond the ordinary, something that would be talked about for generations, something that would become legend. One of the white men in the crowd crossed himself. Did she? How did she? Nobody answered. Nobody had answers. They just stood there staring at the body swinging from the oak tree, at the woman who'd killed 40 men with her cooking, and died reciting scripture with a rope around her neck. Old Moses was the first to move. He started humming, low and quiet at first, then louder. The spiritual Alice had taught them, the one about crossing over, the one about freedom on the other side. Other enslaved folks joined in, their voices rising despite the danger, despite the overseers who might whip them for it. They sang for Alice, sang her home, sang her into legend. And the white folks let them, because what else could they do? They'd just seen a woman speak with a broken neck, had just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, had just learned that maybe, just maybe, they didn't understand the people they'd enslaved as well as they thought they did. The sun climbed higher in that blood-red sky. Alice's body swung gentle in the morning breeze. And far away, in kitchens across Virginia, enslaved cooks paused at their work and felt something shift, felt a story beginning to spread, felt the first seeds of fear being planted in the minds of the masters they served. Alice the cook had died, but her message, her terrible, powerful, necessary message, was just being born. Now you got to understand, children, that some deaths don't end nothing. Some deaths are just the beginning, just the first line of a story that keeps getting written long after the body turns to dust. Alice's death was that kind of death, the kind that becomes legend, that grows bigger than the person who lived it, that carries forward through time like wind that won't ever stop blowing. 1832, 1 year after. In the slave quarters across Virginia, whispers ran like water. Cooks started to be watched more carefully, but that just made the watching feel like fear. White folks who used to eat without thinking now hesitated over every meal, wondering if their servants smiled too much or too little, if the seasoning tasted strange, If tonight's supper might be their last, Alice the cook, they'd whisper in the quarters when night fell and no overseers were listening. Remember Alice the cook. An old woman in Richmond told it to her grandchildren. She fed justice to 40 demons, and even death couldn't silence her voice. That's power, children. That's the kind of power they can't chain. A young man on a plantation in North Carolina heard the story and stopped shuffling when overseers passed, started walking upright, started remembering that oppression required cooperation, and cooperation could be withdrawn in ways small and large. The story mutated as it traveled. Some versions said Alice poisoned 100 men. Some said she died laughing. Some said her ghost still haunted Turner's place, singing psalms in the darkness. The details changed, but the core remained. One woman with knowledge and courage had struck back, and the reverberations were still spreading. 859, the eve of war. By the time John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, by the time the nation was tearing itself apart over slavery, Alice's story had become part of the oral tradition of resistance. Conductors on the Underground Railroad told it in safe houses, used it to encourage freedom seekers who thought they were too scared, too weak, too powerless to run. Remember Alice the cook, they'd say. If one woman in a kitchen could bring down 40 men, imagine what thousands of us together could do. Frederick Douglass heard the story and wrote about it in a letter. The enslaved have been taught that they are powerless, but stories like that of Alice demonstrate the lie inherent in that teaching. Power takes many forms, and knowledge applied with courage is among the most formidable. 1865, Freedom and Memory. When Union soldiers marched through Southampton County during the war, when enslaved people were finally freed, some of them went to the old oak tree where Alice had died. It was still there, massive and ancient, and someone had carved words into the bark. Alice the cook, she fed them justice. The soldiers, black soldiers in Union blue, stood at attention beneath that tree, saluted a woman they'd never met but whose courage had helped light the path to this moment. Because every act of resistance, no matter how small, no matter how brutal its price, added to the weight that eventually broke slavery's back. An elderly woman named Sarah, the same Sarah who'd stood in the crowd that terrible morning, brought flowers, laid them at the base of the tree and whispered, "I ran north like you told me to. Took 50 years, but I came back free. Came back to say thank you." 1920. The stories survive. In the Harlem Renaissance, when black artists and writers were reclaiming their narrative, a young poet named Marcus heard about Alice from his grandmother. He wrote a poem that started, "She cooked rebellion in an iron pot, seasoned suffering with seeds from the motherland, fed justice to the unjust, and sang hymns with a noose around her neck." The poem was published in a small magazine that most white folks never read, but it circulated in black communities, passed hand to hand, memorized and recited at gatherings where people still remembered that resistance took many forms, that courage wore many faces. 1955, Montgomery and Memory. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, when the Montgomery bus boycott transformed a city, an old man at a church meeting stood up and told the story of Alice the cook. "We've been fighting back longer than white folks want to admit," he said. "Been resisting in ways big and small. That sister in Virginia who poisoned those devils, she knew what we still know, that sometimes you got to risk everything because living on your knees ain't really living at all." The young people listened. Some of them would go on to sit at lunch counters, to march across bridges, to put their bodies on the line for freedom. And when they got scared, some of them would remember Alice, just a cook. Just a woman with no weapons except knowledge and courage, and she'd brought down 40 men. 1970, Black Power and Reclamation. In the era of Black Power, when people were studying their history with new eyes, scholars found mentions of Alice in old court records, in plantation documents, in the terrified letters white Virginians wrote to each other in 1831. They pieced together her story from fragments, from whispers, from the deliberately obscured past. A young woman studying African American history at Howard University wrote her thesis on Alice. Poisoning as resistance, the strategic use of domestic knowledge in slave rebellions. She argued that Alice's act wasn't just personal revenge, but political resistance, a calculated strike that used the tools of domesticity as weapons of war. 2003, digital age. The internet age brought new ways to tell old stories. Forums and websites dedicated to Black history featured discussions about Alice. Some historians doubted she'd existed. Surely the story was too perfect, too symbolic, too much like fiction. But others pointed to the evidence, the court records showing 40 deaths at Turner's Place. The newspaper accounts calling it a mysterious poisoning. The oral traditions that had carried the story through generations. The consistency of the core narrative even as details varied. She was real, an elderly woman posted in one forum. My great-great-grandmother knew her. Told my great-grandmother, who told my grandmother, who told me. Alice the cook was real, and what she did mattered. 2025, present day. Today, in a kitchen in Washington, D.C., a young Black woman named Keisha works as a chef in a restaurant that used to be a mansion owned by slaveholders. She keeps a small note taped inside her locker, written in her grandmother's handwriting. Remember Alice the cook. Remember that our ancestors survived, resisted, fought back in ways big and small. Remember that you carry their strength. Remember that cooking can be love or revolution, nourishment or justice. Remember. Keisha reads it every shift before she ties on her apron and picks up her knife. Reads it and stands a little taller. Works with a little more pride. Understands that her labor is part of a lineage that includes someone who turned a kitchen into a battlefield. In classrooms across America, teachers tell Alice's story as part of units on slave resistance. In churches, preachers reference her in sermons about courage. In families, grandparents pass down the tale to children, making sure the memory doesn't die, making sure Alice's name stays alive. And sometimes, on November nights when the air turns cold and the wind picks up, folks swear they can hear it. A woman's voice singing Psalm 23, words carrying across time and distance, a reminder that some voices can't be silenced, some stories refuse to die, some acts of resistance echo forward into eternity. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. The words drift on the wind over Virginia's red clay, over the place where Turner's Place used to stand before time, and justice tore it down, over the fields that once held enslaved people and now hold memories. Alice the cook died in 1831, but her spirit, Lord have mercy, her spirit still walks, still speaks, still reminds us that the powerless can become powerful, that knowledge is a weapon, that resistance takes many forms, and that sometimes, just sometimes, justice comes from the last place oppressors think to look, the hands that feed them. Remember her name, tell her story, because as long as we remember, as long as we tell, as long as we refuse to forget, Alice the cook is still here, still feeding us courage from across the years, still teaching us that survival isn't enough when liberation is possible. And that's how memory was born. That's how one woman's act became everyone's inspiration. That's how a cook in Virginia became a legend that time can't erase. Those who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted left us memory. And memory, we keep it here, in the echoes from the quarters.